We now come to the Opposition Day motion on the British Indian Ocean Territory. I inform the House that I have not selected the amendments. I now call Shadow Secretary of State Dame Priti Patel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move the motion that stands in my name and in the names of the Honourable and Right Honourable friends. Mr. Speaker, Labour's £35 billion Chagos surrender deal is falling apart every single day. And it's high time that the Prime Minister tore up this atrocious surrender treaty and put Britain's interests and our defence first and our security first and Britain's hard-pressed taxpayers first. This side of the House has made it clear from day one at every opportunity to expose the deceit, falsehoods and foolishness of the approach taken by Labour. Whether it's on international law arguments, the defence and security arguments, the costs arguments, the important self-determination arguments of the Chagossian people standing up for their rights, and of course the environmental arguments. It has been Conservatives on this side of the House standing up for Britain's national interests and have unequivocally opposed this surrender treaty. I will give way.
Grateful to my honourable friend, and building on what she's just said there, is she not shocked that most Labour MPs cannot be bothered to turn up for this debate?
And is absolutely right. And, you know, I just think it demonstrates their disdain and contempt for the British people, quite frankly. It really does. And while the Prime Minister and, in fact, their various ministers travel the globe, it's pretty obvious that they all go around waving the white flag of surrender. They can sit there chuntering, but the British public can see exactly what's going on with this government. Weak people and giving away their money. Had the Prime Minister... So the Minister is chuntering about starting the negotiations. This deal is on him. It's on their government. It's on the Labour government and your lefty friends and your international law agreements. And perhaps he'd like to listen, because had the Prime Minister... You can sit there, absolutely do listen, because they may learn a few things today. Had the Prime Minister and his dear friend, the Attorney-General, perhaps she'd like to contribute to the debate. She'd perhaps put her name in to even speak. Then I suggest she sits and listen. Had the Prime Minister and the Attorney-General and the real Foreign Secretary, Jonathan Powell, and the current and former secretaries who are in former secretaries in name but only, got their way, then the Murrison flag would already be flying over the Chagos archipelago, and hundreds of millions of the £35 billion of taxpayers' money would already be in the coffers, lining the coffers of a foreign government. I will give way. Yeah.
My right honourable friend, may I invite her to challenge the Minister to deal with the issue of the Patel Treaty, which came into force, I think, in 2009, designed to prevent African nuclear proliferation. If we breach that treaty by means of this deal, it will open up an opportunity for all kinds of hostile powers, including China and others, to site nuclear weapons in Africa. Do the government realise that? And I know my honourable friend certainly does.
Yeah, well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. And, of course, again, it's this side of the House that's been raising this issue, because guess what? It gives succour and strength to Britain's enemies. So all the people, basically, that are working against us, China, Russia, Iran, they'd be accelerating, they're plotting with their Mauritian friends on how to undermine the operationalisation of the military base at Diego Garcia and exert their influence in the Indo-Pacific at the expense of all our interests. I will give way.
I commend the Shadow Minister and indeed the Conservatives for bringing forward with a consistent focus on what they're trying to do. But does the Shadow Minister share the concerns over the long-term guarantee for the UK and the right to extend the military lease and the right of access within the treaty, and the fact that this essential base can never have no ambiguity attached to it in any way?
Is absolutely right, and this speaks to the fundamental point about the capitulation, the surrender, the way in which this government has worked night and day. We see it now in terms of working against Britain and Britain's interests, and that is unforgivable. I will give way to my right honourable friend.
My right honourable friend, who I must say is making an excellent start to this attack on the government, but I will ask her this simple question, which shouldn't we also dig a little bit deeper as to some of the linkages between, say, the Prime Minister and some of his earlier colleagues, to learn that Philippe Sands, who was representing the Mauritian government, had a deal done with the Russians over Crimea in which he assured them, I understand, that the granting of independence and ownership for Mauritius would not impinge on their right to stay in Crimea, which brought them to vote and support this. Doesn't that look to you, like to my right honourable friend and to myself, as absolute method traitorship?
Yes, my right honourable friend has made his point very clearly. This is a government that effectively is not standing up for our values, our interests, or even making any effort whatsoever to demonstrate that it's on the side of our national security. And fundamentally, this is what it's been all about. And, Mr Speaker, you will absolutely know it's been the diligent work and the scrutiny of Conservatives in this House and in the other place that's led the government being forced to pause in this surrender through our diligent diplomatic engagement with the US administration, asking over 400 parliamentary questions, 2 opposition day debates, and thanks to you, Mr Speaker, urgent question after urgent question, here to demand answers which they never provide, they only hide. This is all thanks to this government's shameful and outright contempt of Parliament and the British public. We have proudly made representations on behalf of the Chagosian people. Not only have they been betrayed, Mr Speaker, but they're also now being threatened in Britain, and their family members are now being intimidated by people associated with the government of Mauritius, who seem to be learning how to conduct transnational repression from their Chinese Communist Party friends. This Labour government will go down in history for many, many terrible things, and they can now add to that list of shame the repression and betrayal of the Chagosian people. Labour must rethink their deeply corrosive policy, which is putting our security and the safety of the Chagosian people at risk. But instead, we have a weak and feeble Prime Minister currently on his knees in Beijing, who will do anything possible to push through this deal, a deal that has been constructed and negotiated by his left-wing international lawyer friends, whose views he seems to value much more than the British people and the Chagosian community. And, Mr Speaker, we all know how this has gone completely wrong. The Prime Minister can take a different course, and it's gone wrong because this surrender is completely unnecessary, because, as this side of the House knows, it's based on an advisory opinion. Exactly. And ministers have failed to give convincing answers as to why we will accept this. There is no answer on what enforcement mechanisms would exist. So tell us today, please, other than some hypothetical comments about the electromagnetic spectrum and the ITU. Mr Speaker, we not only have a government of incompetent politicians, it's a government of incompetent lawyers. And in the words of President Trump, Labour is surrendering sovereignty for no reason whatsoever. But it's not just the fact that they are misinterpreting international law, given that this Labour government's obsession with international law. It is surprising and shocking to see that they've overlooked essential detail, Mr Speaker. Very important detail. This detail in the 1966 UK-US exchange of notes, which is now the 3rd time I brought this to the dispatch box in just the last week. The 1966 treaty with the USA, which establishes the military base on Diego Garcia. And it states, for the avoidance of any doubt in this House, or even any ignorance on behalf of the benches opposite, the territory, and that's the whole of the British Indian Ocean Territory, shall remain under British sovereignty, subject to the provision as set out below. The islands, that's all of the Chagos Islands, not just Diego Garcia, shall be made available to meet the needs of both governments for defence. This is a legally binding treaty between the United Kingdom and the United States of America regarding the British Indian Ocean Territory, and any attempt for the UK to surrender sovereignty over Biot violates international law. And yet, when the government signed and published their treaty on the 22nd of May last year, and then published their surrender bill, there wasn't a single mention of the treaty, in the treaty, or the bill, of any of these explanatory notes, or the need for the exchange of notes. So on Monday, in response to the urgent question, the Minister for the Overseas Territory said, "We have been clear throughout that before the UK can ratify the treaty, we'll need to do the following: pass primary and secondary legislation, update the UK-US agreement, the exchange of notes, and put in place agreements on environment, marine protection, security, migration." But this was not mentioned in any of the documents accompanying the legislation, let alone the treaty. And when we questioned this in both houses, ministers have merely mentioned talks are ongoing to update the UK-US exchange of letters, as the exchange of notes was not even referred to in any of the accompanied documents for the legislation. I think this House deserves an explanation. When did these talks begin? What is the status of these talks? What is the timescale for making changes? Have the Americans raised concerns that the exchange of notes were not part of the original discussions with the US government last year, when the Prime Minister said the US supported the treaty? And why was the government, why did they try to force through this surrender bill without confirming the future of this exchange of notes? I will give way.
Very good. Give way, because the key question on this part is negotiations may well be ongoing, but this rests on whether the UK can make a unilateral decision to give sovereignty away without the blessing of the US. Now, I posed this question. It was posed 3 times on Monday, and the Minister simply said it's in discussion. So the Ministers need to answer directly today, can this be done unilaterally or not?
Well, this is the perfect debate and opportunity for the government, and perhaps the Minister would like to intervene right now, and I'm very, very happy for her to answer that question. And I think just shortly, and I think there is also another question. Has the American administration questioned why the British government, the United Kingdom, would want to give up sovereignty of the British Indian Ocean Territory and, in doing so, violate international law? For once, the Minister just needs to be straightforward and give precise answers to what are precise questions that these benches have, because the government has continuously failed to do so. And by the way, British taxpayers rightly want an explanation as to why their taxes should line the pockets of the government of Mauritius without full and proper scrutiny and disclosure and transparency that they deserve. So perhaps the Minister can tell us what exactly did the National Security Advisor, Mr Powell, and the former Ambassador, Lord Mandelson, do we remember him? What did they tell the US administration about the surrender treaty? It is well known that the government is run by its friends and cronies, and it's also well known that Jonathan Powell, a friend of China, accelerated the negotiations when he was appointed envoy in September 2024. And frankly, can anyone in this House really trust anything that Lord Mandelson would have been involved in? I think that's definitely a question for the government. I will, of course, give way.
Would the Right Honourable Lady agree that we stand at a critical point, not just for this nation, but for the United States of America, and that they too should have regard to the fact that up to this point, the islands are under the control of a nuclear power with a navy, and this proposition, this treaty, would hand them over to a country over 1,000 miles away with no navy? And doesn't that create an obvious geopolitical vacuum to which we are all vulnerable? And shouldn't the Americans in particular be very wary of that?
Well, my honourable friend, absolutely, as he is many times actually, spot on. He really is. And, I think this is exactly why the Minister today has this marvellous opportunity to explain to the House and also to the British public. Because let's not forget, President Trump, the Commander-in-Chief, said that the UK is giving away extremely important land. It's an act of great stupidity. I think this House would agree with those comments. There is no doubt that China and Russia have noted this act of total weakness. Has there been any minister-to-minister engagement with the US administration? Has the Prime Minister directly spoken to the President on this matter before he kowtowed to China? I asked this very question here on Monday, but the Minister, who is not here today, could not answer this question. So this is a new opportunity for the Minister for the Indo-Pacific to tell us, is it a yes or no? And on that point as well, it's worth asking, should there be a change in the proposed US-UK treaty, will this come to Parliament through the 21-day CRAG process? Because, again, we asked this on Monday and the Minister refused to answer the question. So what are they trying to hide? Because Labour failed to provide this House with the scrutiny under the previous CRAG process. So it's clear that they're happy to give away the sovereign territory and billions in taxpayers' money without being held to account. And given the Labour government's abject failure to clarify these points, it took Conservatives in the other place to take action, which led to the pause of this treaty. But instead of showing some humility, transparency and commitment to engage in proper scrutiny, Labour have sought to gaslight its critics, and by the way, the British public, with a spokesperson from the government telling the media This is irresponsible, reckless behaviour by peers. Blaming peers, Conservative, crossbenchers and others down there for doing their job diligently is another new low from a Labour government seeking to undermine accountability, democracy, scrutiny and accountability. So when the junior minister for the Indo-Pacific responds, I hope she will respond on behalf of this feeble Labour government and apologise to the British people for their appalling and discredited conduct. I will give way.
My right honourable friend, and like her, I'm proud of the role that Conservative peers have played in the other place. But can we also take a moment to pay credit to backbench Labour MPs? Because I think it's important to note, Mr. Speaker, they're not here. Literally, practically the only person scribbling is the member for Rugby, who I admire a great deal, but loyalist he is to his very core. If he's practically the only person who's prepared to speak up, the truth is they've moved with their feet and they now agree with my right honourable friend. This deal has to go.
To thank and commend my right honourable friend for his intervention, because he's actually highlighted a lot of things, and in the interest of time, because we've got a lot of colleagues that do want to speak as well. Do you know, it's just worth pointing out, yes, they'll have a few of their sort of the ones that like to climb the greasy pole. I think there is one that's not here today, who's now the trade envoy for Mauritius, because he did speak up so frequently for the government. But of course, ultimately, this is about the security and the defence of our country. And when it looks, and the government has a lot of questions to answer, it really has, because the remarks of the government have been absolutely shameful when it comes to their feeble defence of this entire process. It really has. Whether it's on China and the relationship not just they have with China, but the government of Mauritius has with China as well. Completely misleading remarks about China and Mauritius, when it's this side of the House that has constantly called out the cosy relationship. And I've even brought some press cuttings here for the Minister, who may, as the Minister for the Indo-Pacific, she may have seen this already, but I would advise her to read the Chinese Foreign Affairs Ministry website, because it's a weekly diary now of their friendly relationship with the government of Mauritius. On the Patel Treaty, we've already heard on this side of the House the comments about what this now means. We think it's absolutely wrong to inhibit and restrict our ability when it comes to stationing nuclear deterrent on Diego Garcia, and it's right that this side of the House continues to question this all. And on the money, let's just discuss the money, Mr. Speaker, and I will close my remarks shortly. It is an absolute disgrace that this House has not had full disclosure around the money. It's in the public interest for ministers to tell the truth, to be held account, and to stop hiding the true costs behind literally misrepresenting the positions of the OBR and the government's actuary department. That's just utterly shameful. So, Mr. Speaker, today Labour MPs have an opportunity to join with us. They're all in hiding because they're embarrassed about this, and stop this surrender. They can tell their constituents that they voted to save a British territory from being lost, stood up for our defence and security, voted to save £35 billion from being handed over to a foreign government disgracefully, while their taxes at home go up and public services are squeezed, and voted to defend the rights of the Chagossians. Or they can be sleepwalk through the division lobbies like sheep, defending the indefensible, and backing another Labour weak policy and failure of their enfeebled Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, Conservatives have opposed this deal from day one at every stage, and we will continue to do so. We'll fight to kill this bill in order to defend British sovereignty and, of course, defend Britain's pride and national interest.
The question is as on the order paper. Minister Seema Malhotra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is a pleasure to respond to this debate today. And perhaps let me start by saying that the government opposes the motion introduced by the opposition today. The treaty guarantees the full UK operational control of Diego Garcia for generations to come. The motion proposes, I will just make some remarks first, the motion proposes a wildly exaggerated cost in contrast to the actual costings published by this government at the time of the treaty's introduction, verified by the Independent Government Actuaries Department. This motion invokes an exchange of notes which the government has publicly confirmed is being updated with our US partners. And it attempts to bind parliamentary procedure on that exchange, despite it not having yet been finalised. This isn't patriotic. It is political point scoring at the expense of our national security, a sad indictment of what the official opposition have become. I will give way.
Minister giving way. She refers to the issue of the numbers, the cost. Does she agree with me that the government's actually confirmed that the number is over £34 billion?
No. And I will say as well that I will take no truck from Reform, who frankly have no record on supporting the security of our country, especially with what's happened in Wales. And I will continue with my remarks. Thank you very much. And I will, if the opposition may not want to hear this. The opposition may not want to hear this, but the Tories backed negotiations over Chagos every step of the way. 85% of the Chagos negotiations took place under the Conservatives, led by the former Foreign Secretary. And indeed, they may not want to hear this, but I think it's important to share. They may not want to hear this, but I think it's important to share. And in November 2022, the former Foreign Secretary said that through negotiations, aren't they? I think a lot of people are interested in the past.
Order. Can I just say the two front benches either intervene each other, not having this running battle? Seema Malhotra.
Thank you. I will make slight progress, and then I will give way to the right honourable gentleman. And indeed, the former Foreign Secretary did say in November 2022 that taking into account relevant legal proceedings, it is our intention to secure an agreement on the basis of international law to resolve all outstanding issues. In February last year, a spokesperson for the Leader of the Opposition insisted she understood negotiations over the islands were needed due to the international legal position. And the current Leader of the Opposition, they might have not remembered who she is, but she is still in her post, I believe. She may have deferred it to Reform, no? But what I will say is that there has been ample, and this is a serious point, there has been ample time for debate on this topic. Indeed, my honourable friend, the member for Cardiff South and Penarth, the Minister for Overseas Territories, debated this for over 2 hours last week and for 45 minutes on Monday for an urgent question. Baroness Chapman of Darlington has spent hours debating the topic in the other place, including delivering an urgent question repeat on Monday. We have committed to this deal and to these hours of debate because it is important that we do so. Courts had already begun to make decisions which undermined our position in relation to the security of the base. I will give way to the Honourable.
Very grateful, and I'm a little worried that she's confusing the issue of ministers coming to the dispatch box and not answering questions with proper scrutiny of what's going on. So here's a very specific question for her. She has heard previously about the Pelindaba Treaty. Now, Mauritius is a signatory, and that means all the signatories declare their territory to be nuclear-free zones, effectively. So if in the future the Americans, with our agreement and approval, wish to have some nuclear weapons permanently or temporarily in the base at Diego Garcia, will they be able to do so if Mauritius has sovereignty over the islands?
I thank the honourable member, right honourable member, for his comments, and the answer to that is has been set out, and I will be laying it out. Has been set out as well by Lord Coker. The answer is yes, and it has been set out by Lord Coker as well in the House, and I will be coming on to that in my remarks as well. But I will just say there has been questions from the opposition today, Mr. Speaker, about the legal matters behind this treaty. It is important to say that Mauritius's legal claim of sovereignty over the island of Diego Garcia is supported by a number of international institutions, including the UN General Assembly. And the International Court of Justice considered this an issue in the advisory opinion delivered in February. I will give way.
I understand, further to my honourable friend's point, that the Prime Minister of Mauritius has made it specifically clear yesterday that he would not allow or agree to the placing of any nuclear weapons on the islands. Now, can she please answer, then, how can they reassure the USA?
I will be coming on to this in my remarks. I will be coming on to this in my remarks as well, and that is important. I will be coming on to this in my remarks. And in relation to I do want to finish the point on the legal points that have been raised. What was said in relation to this by the International Court of Justice in the advisory opinion is it does carry significant weight, and in particular it's likely to be influential on any subsequent court or tribunal considering the issues arising out of disputed sovereignty and whose judgment would be binding in international law. The ICJ, I will finish my remarks on this, the ICJ concluded that the United Kingdom is under an obligation to bring to an end its administration of the Chagos Archipelago as rapidly as possible. You might want to listen to the next bit. The 2019 advisory opinion was followed in 2021 by a special chamber of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in a case about delimitation of the boundary between Mauritius and the Maldives, which ruled that Mauritius sovereignty was inferred from the ICJ's determination.
Will the other lady give way?
Who are you giving way to, Minister? There's three of them thinking it's them.
Minister, specifically on this point, that 2021 judgment did not have any British representation and rested on the UN's non-binding judgment. We also know from the 2015 ruling that that court cannot preside over sovereignty. So how does that stand up to the scrutiny that she's saying there is a dire need to hand these islands over?
And can we have nuclear weapons there?
I thank the honourable member for his comments. He will know that these matters have been shared before in the House, but I perhaps may remind him what US Secretary Hegseth has said as well, that the UK's very important deal with Mauritius secures the operational capabilities of the base and key...
Dr. Evans, no. Dr. Evans, do you have to keep chunnering? You've asked the question, you're getting an answer. I don't need a run... No, I wouldn't bother giving me a back chat, please. I don't need the run commentary. Just let's calm it down a little. It doesn't look good on TV. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will just remind the honourable member what the US Secretary Hegseth has said, which is that the UK's very important deal with Mauritius secures the operational capabilities of the base and key US national security interests in the region. We are confident the base is protected for many years to come. I will just continue with my remarks and can certainly able to give way shortly. And it is therefore as well the UK's long-standing legal view that if Mauritius challenged us again in the courts, we would struggle to defend our position. Our Indo-Pacific foothold and the operation of the base could be put at risk within weeks. That's why the government remains fully committed to the deal to secure the joint UK-US base on Diego Garcia, which is vital for our national security.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady. Mr. Speaker, this is a fundamental point. the most sensitive part of our military is the nuclear deterrent. It is critical to the defence of ourselves and of our allies, the United States, also nuclear armed. We are a naval nuclear nation. This is a critical naval base in strategic terms, Mr. Speaker, at Diego Garcia. Can I ask the Honourable Lady, yesterday it was reported that the Deputy Prime Minister of Mauritius, Mr. Berenger, had declared that nuclear weapons could not be stored on Mauritius if sovereignty is restored to them. Does she understand that that is the case?
I thank the Shadow Minister, and as a matter of long-standing policy, he will know, and he will know also in relation to his previous work in Parliament and government, that we do not comment on operational matters or in relation to locations of nuclear weapons. The opposition knows, if I may make some comments on Palindama Treaty, on the relation to Palindama Treaty. Sorry.
Point of order, Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On a point of order, the Minister said that she was going to address the issue of whether nuclear weapons could go to Diego Garcia, and now she says she can't comment. Are those...
No. You're on the chairman... No, just... You're on the chairman's panel. You know it's not even a point of order. It's not even the start of one. All you're doing is trying to continue the debate without even being able to speak. I'm sure you're on the list to get the point of order, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the honourable member may not have realised I was just on line 1 of a page of comments on that particular issue. So I'm sorry that he chose that moment to interrupt proceedings. As I was saying, it is a matter of long-standing policy, as is known, that we don't comment on operational procedures. The opposition knows this and, of course, took the same approach in government. But as Minister Doughty told the Foreign Affairs Committee, we are confident that nothing in this treaty conflicts with our abilities to uphold international law and to continue to operate the base as we do today. As the Lord Coker...
On that point.
I'm continuing with my remarks.
On that point.
No, I will continue with my remarks. It's as if the front bench can't decide who to give the speech today. As the Lord Coker told the other place in November, the UK-Mauritius agreement enables the continued operation of the base to its full capability. We will continue to be able to deploy the full range of advanced military capabilities to Diego Garcia. It is not just us. The agreement has been tested at the highest levels of the US security establishment under not one but two administrations. They too were satisfied that it protects the full operation of the base. And we indeed have agreed with the Mauritian government that nothing in the treaty, this is an agreement with the Mauritian government, that we've agreed this with the Mauritian government, that nothing in the treaty conflicts with our respective commitments and are absolutely clear that we can continue to operate the base as we have done and do so now.
On that point,
I'm going to just continue with my remarks. I have given way. I've been very generous in giving way. No, I will continue with my remarks. What was that? Sorry? Okay, is that in order, Mr. Speaker?
It's getting touchy. We don't want it to get touchy. I want it to be tolerant and respectful. It's up to the Minister whether she wishes to give way. Actually, it is in order. It's been used from this side as well. So please, let's not forget our memories. And it's a bit like the idea of where we are now. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given these security risks, this government, like the government before it, made the decision to negotiate with Mauritius to secure a deal to protect the base and to protect the UK. Our agreement ensures full operational control of Diego Garcia, a 24 nautical mile buffer zone where nothing can be built or placed without UK consent. A rigorous process, including joint decision-making, to prevent any activities on the wider islands, some over 100 nautical miles away, from disrupting base operations, full UK control, over the presence of full UK control over the presence of foreign security forces on the outer islands, whether civilian or military, and a binding obligation to ensure the operation of the base is never undermined. I'm just going to continue with my remarks at the moment. And as I have said, we are confident that nothing in this treaty conflicts with our abilities to uphold international law and to be able to continue to operate the base as we do today. Now, I want to move on to talk about the UK-US relationship. We have been clear that before the UK can ratify the treaty, we will need to do the following: pass primary and secondary legislation, update the UK-US exchange of notes, and put in place arrangements on the environment, maritime security and migration. This government considers it our duty to protect the public. Therefore, it is our duty to pursue this agreement with clarity and resolve. And we will not put party politics ahead of national security, as we are seeing the opposition do today. We have made very strong progress. Towards finalising an updated UK-US agreement, and will reach an agreement on it before the agreement between the United Kingdom and Mauritius concerning the Chagos Archipelago, including Diego Garcia, is ratified. These matters are still under negotiation, and so it remains to be determined whether any updated agreement will be subject to ratification. And we will keep Parliament informed about this. I will give way.
Great thing to the Minister for giving way. I listened to the criteria that she expressed before ratification is possible. Is American agreement one of the criteria that she considers essential?
I thank the honourable member for his question. Indeed, he will have heard me say that before the UK can ratify the treaty, we will need to do the following, which is pass primary legislation and secondary legislation, update the UK-US exchange of notes, and put in place arrangements on the environment, maritime security and migration. And it is important. I will continue with my remarks on this. I do want to finish shortly. The strength of the deal and the protection of national security is exactly why the US endorsed the deal last year, and why Secretary of State Rubio called it a monumental achievement. This agreement safeguards the interests of both the United Kingdom and the United States well into the next century. I will briefly turn to costs, because a financial contribution over the 99 years was always necessary to safeguard the operation of such a vital base. We published comprehensive detail on the payment schedule alongside the treaty. This was laid in the House within minutes of the signature of the treaty. The figures used by the government were verified by the independent Government Actuaries Department in line with standard accounting practices. Those who seek to imply that the government has misled the public on this do so without the facts. So let me set those out. First, the Office of Statistics Regulation welcomed the government's approach to setting out the methodology and confirmed that it is in line with the principles of intelligent transparency. Second, the Office for Budget Responsibility has confirmed that the discount rates used by the government were the reasonable ones to use. Thirdly, the figures have been verified by the House of Commons Library and scrutinised by BBC Verify and The Independent. All these confirmed that the government calculated the figures correctly. But beyond the numbers, it's also important to, as this House has done, to debate the challenges that have been raised in relation to the Chagosian community, and rightly so. They're a vibrant and diverse community that is now seeing the opposition's political tactics, the same opposition who, after ruling out resettlement for the Chagosians, and committing to a £40 million package. They may want to answer about ruling out resettlement for the Chagossians, and committing to a £40 million package of support in 2016, succeeded in spending just £1.6 million by the time this government came into power. And since coming into power, I will just conclude my remarks. I'm sorry, I have taken a number of interventions today. Since coming into power, this government has been clear on its deep regret for the way in which Chagossians were removed from the islands, and sought to recognise the wide range of views within the Chagossian community, and remain committed to building a relationship with the Chagossian community that is built on respect and an acknowledgement of the wrongs of the past. We have established a contact group to give Chagossians a greater say in UK government support to their communities, and are in the process of enhancing that group, as Baroness Chapman committed to doing in the other place. FCDO officials have engaged with Chagossian individuals and groups over 30 times, and they are regularly in conversation with the Minister for the Overseas Territories. So in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, this deal was right and essential to do. It protects our national interest. It defends our national security. It protects the Diego Garcia base from legal threat. It supports the Chagossian community and preserves the unique environment in the archipelago. We know that the best way to do that is to pursue this deal, and it is time the opposition realised, or should I say, remembered that too.
I call the Liberal Democrat spokesperson Calum Miller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The process for negotiating this treaty with the Government of Mauritius has been utterly shambolic since it began under the last government. For one of the most striking aspects of this entire process has been the confected consternation of the Conservatives, despite having accepted the need for negotiations in the first place while in government, and continued these throughout their time in office. Yet it is clear that this Labour government has also tied itself in knots by failing to first finalise negotiations with the United States linked to Diego Garcia. This has created new and fundamental problems with the government's bill. There are now serious questions about whether the treaty would undermine the UK's other international obligations. So will the government take on board the Liberal Democrat amendment in the other place and commit to securing a firm assessment of the position of the US in relation to the Diego Garcia military base before any further attempts to progress its bill?
Very grateful to the honourable member giving way. He is really talking about some of the key issues here in relation to the US and its agreement. But in relation to remarks from the US, I remember being contacted by my friend on the morning her brother was injured severely in an IED explosion in Afghanistan, and I've had many constituents in touch with me who are deeply angry about the remarks of President Trump in relation to our service personnel. Does he agree with me that the rowing back is not sufficient and the President needs to give an apology to British service personnel?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for her intervention. Donald Trump's remarks about NATO troops were untrue and deeply offensive, and I welcome the robust response from parties across this House to them. Yet there was no apology. We deserve an apology from the US President, and Liberal Democrats have called on the Prime Minister to summon the US Ambassador to offer an explanation for these remarks and an apology to the veterans affected and to the families of the 457 brave personnel who paid the ultimate sacrifice in fighting alongside US forces in Afghanistan. I shall.
He's making a number of very serious points here, and does he see, as I do, a sort of parallel between President Trump's behaviour over that egregious issue about NATO troops not allegedly being in the front line and this issue about Diego Garcia? because the fact is he makes certain comments, and then, when confronted with the truth, he has to try and elaborate on them, even if he won't go so far as to say the dreaded words, "I'm sorry." Isn't that what's happening here? The Americans did not realise the extent to which giving up sovereignty over the base would compromise their military situation. And we have not heard anything to say that Mauritius couldn't stop any nuclear weapons ever in future being on Diego Garcia.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his intervention, but I was in the chamber on Monday when the same gentleman made the remark that it was a fine aspect of joint working between Reform and the Conservatives to bring this view from Donald Trump about. I do not think it's appropriate for the leader of the Reform Party to be whispering in the ear of the US President to upset negotiations, and I think the right honourable member is making a brave point when he appears to suggest that the fact that the US President has moved in one direction recently means that it will be sustained in the future. That notwithstanding, it is the case that the US President has made these recent remarks about the Chagos Islands, and we will have to take those into consideration in the progress of this bill. We need to reflect on the other outstanding problems, however, with the government's proposed legislation. Since the start of debates over the treaty, Liberal Democrats have been the only party consistently championing the rights of Chagossians. That stands in contrast to the government's lack of substantive engagement with the Chagossian community. Chagossians have been denied a meaningful say in their future, and the provisions of the treaty shamefully fail to affirm their rights. But this is not only a failing of the government. Indeed, despite the remarks of the Shadow Foreign Secretary, the motion we are debating today in her name includes not a single reference to the Chagossian community, something that is addressed in the amendment laid in my name on behalf of my party. And I hear the Shadow Defence Secretary asking if I listened to the Shadow Foreign Secretary's speech. I did indeed. The point I'm making is that when the Conservatives had the opportunity to provide the bases for their objection to this bill, they didn't once mention the rights of the Chagossian community. And it's clear that those rights are just as low a priority for the Conservatives as they are for the government. When Liberal Democrats proposed an amendment to the bill at third reading in this House that would have provided for a referendum of the Chagossian people, the Conservatives failed to back it and the government opposed it. Even at this late stage, however, I want to encourage the government to reconsider its position. There remains a window of opportunity for the government to support the rights of Chagossians and buck the historic trend of this community being left out of decisions about their future. So will the government support a second Liberal Democrat amendment in the other place, requiring binding guarantees from the government of Mauritius for the rights of Chagossians? Another outstanding issue remains the question of money. The government is proposing to send billions of pounds to Mauritius, despite having what appears to be zero monitoring, evaluation or recall mechanisms built into the treaty. It is frankly inconceivable that the government would oppose the introduction of such measures and fail to support the principle that the UK should be able to cease future payments to Mauritius if the treaty is deemed to no longer support the UK's security. So will the government back a third Liberal Democrat amendment in the other place, introducing meaningful and effective safeguards around the proposed vast sums of public funds due to be sent to Mauritius? Please.
On this particular point that he's making, it is really an important point because the government has said that it has cleared this with the OBR, but the reality is that the actuaries are very clear about what they say. The only way you can calculate this, you cannot calculate it on the basis of what happens in Mauritius with social issues and with inflation. That is ridiculous. You have to calculate it on the basis that the agreement you made gives you a total at the end, which is 34.7 billion. Does he not agree that dodging around that really is a low position for the government to take?
I thank the right honourable gentleman for his remarks. And the way I think about it, the government is proposing to write 99 years' worth of cheques to the Mauritius that the Mauritians will be able to cash over that period. It only stands to reason that this Parliament should be able to scrutinise such a large amount of expenditure during the duration of the treaty in order that there is some accountability for these funds. As things stand, Madam Deputy Speaker, this deal appears to be going the way of the dodo, another redundant creature that originated in Mauritius. I implore the government to listen to the concerns raised across this House and recognise that the bill in its current form is not fit for purpose.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I feel I should say at the beginning and put on record that I'm not the government's trade envoy to Mauritius. Hansard can record a diplomatic silence at that point, Madam Deputy Speaker. This debate ultimately turns on whether we understand the world as it is, not as we might wish it to be, as much as some believe otherwise. We still live in an interconnected, economically, militarily, politically, morally world, and that interconnectedness has not gone away. It's become more contested, it's become more multipolar, and certainly more strategic, but it hasn't ended. And that matters because this deal must be judged not on slogans or hyperbole, but on whether it secures the United Kingdom's security interests in that interconnected world. Now, one of the central lessons of recent years is that uncertainty invites challenge. We see that every day in the South China Sea. China has asserted expansive territorial claims that many countries do not recognise, that international courts and tribunals do not recognise. And what happens in response? Other states deliberately sail ships and fly aircraft through those waters and airspace to contest those claims and to test resolve. Uncertainty becomes a pressure point, and ambiguity becomes an opportunity for interference. And so if we allow ambiguity to persist over the Chagos, and in particular Diego Garcia, the same dynamic could apply. Our claims may be strong historically, but they are being increasingly contested in international courts. And that doesn't make the base more secure, it makes it more vulnerable. It creates exactly the kind of grey zone in which hostile actors thrive, including an ever-expanding Chinese navy. This treaty removes that uncertainty. It closes off the space for challenge rather than leaving it open. I'm happy to give way to my own friend.
The mistake he makes is in buying into China's narrative that there is a grey zone in the South China Sea. There is no grey zone. They shouldn't be there. They don't care less. They go anyway. So the idea that some agreement we meet that the Mauritius agree with is going to stop China acting at a later date is complete nonsense, as they prove all the time in the South China Sea every day.
I thank the honourable member for his point. I do disagree with him. The two situations do have parallels. In the South China Sea, people are challenging Chinese sovereignty, and it's been proved not to have standing in international courts. Now, at the moment, ambiguity is starting to arrive in our position over the Chagos Islands. This treaty would remove it and remove cause for the Chinese Navy to take advantage. And against that backdrop, allow me to make some headway, if that's all right. Against that backdrop, I want to restate the tests that I set out in an earlier debate on this deal. Does the agreement protect our national security? Does it command the support of our allies and professional security community? Are the costs proportionate to the benefits? And on each of these tests, the answer remains yes. Diego Garcia is a keystone of our joint security architecture in the Indo-Pacific. It's where UK and US forces operate together against terrorist threats. It's a logistics, communications and intelligence hub, and it is central to safeguarding global trade routes on which our economy depends. Without a secure base, all of that is placed at risk. Our Five Eyes allies in Canada, Australia and New Zealand support this deal. Our strategic partner, India, supports this deal. And I want to address briefly the noise around President Trump's social media post. I think the Minister dealt with it very well earlier. Social media is not statecraft. What matters is the settled position of the United States, its military leadership and its security agencies. And on that, for some time, there has been clarity. The Pentagon, the State Department and successive US Defense Secretaries, Republican and Democrat, have supported this agreement. As I said at the beginning, interconnectedness is incredibly important, and we cannot ignore that international opinion matters. Yes, the world has changed. Power today is exercised through force, and that's become incredibly important. Hard power has become important, but also still through legitimacy, alliances and rules. If we expect others to respect international rules where it suits us, whether in Ukraine or the South China Sea, we cannot be seen to apply it selectively elsewhere except in the supreme national interest. The treaty secures... Happy to give way to my honourable member.
Admirer of the honourable gentleman. He's courteous and thoughtful, and I always listen to what he says with great focus and attention. Does he accept, however, that we have... He's criticising the dangers of ambiguity, and I agree with that point. Does he accept, however, that we haven't cleared up the ambiguity about whether nuclear weapons could ever be on Diego Garcia if the Americans and the British wanted them to be? It is no good saying, as his front bench spokesman, the minister, said, we never talk about deployments of nuclear weapons. We're not asking about deployments of nuclear weapons, we're asking about the legal position if the case was that the Americans or the British wanted to have some nuclear weapons, temporarily or permanently, on Diego Garcia. If we transfer sovereignty to a country that is signed up to be part of a nuclear-free zone, that is bound to call into doubt the ability to have nuclear weapons there in the future. Can he clear up that point?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I can't clear up that point for him. I have great confidence the ministerial colleagues would, but we have been told at all points that this treaty will ensure the continued effectiveness of the base in the way that it's run now. There was an Ohio-class submarine there in 2022, and I hope those arrangements continue under this treaty, and there's no reason from what I've heard from ministers that it wouldn't. And let's turn to the costs of the deal as well. It costs a fraction of the defence budget for an irreplaceable asset. And I can't see any interventions at that point. I thought there might be. Happy to give way to mine.
Could the honourable member clarify precisely how much of the cost of the Chagos Islands deal will come from the Ministry of Defence budget?
The honourable member, I'm sure that's been set out already in several debates. I think the point that hasn't been set out, though, adequately, and of course it can't be set out in huge detail, but in exchange for providing the United States with facilities on Diego Garcia, the in-kind support in terms of intelligence and other matters that we receive from the United States must run into the billions every single year. And although you can't put a figure on that, I do think that's a really important element in this debate. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, there isn't prosperity without security, and there isn't security without certainty. And in an interconnected world, those are not abstract principles, they're strategic necessities. That's why, in my view, this is a sensible, hard-headed deal and a confident assertion of the United Kingdom's national interest. Thank you.
Dr. Andrew Murrison.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. What a pleasure it is to be called so soon. I'm very grateful to you. My goodness me, I do feel sorry for the Minister being wheeled out to defend the indefensible. I have to say her right honourable friend, the member for Cardiff South and Penarth, has done a Trojan piece of work on behalf of the government consistently, and it's only fair that he should be given the day off. Every day is a school day when it comes to Chagos, is it not? We learn something new every day of the week, it seems. And in that wonderful Keynesian way, perhaps the government might like to reflect on when the facts change, we change our mind. Apparently not. The facts have changed. The ground truth has certainly changed on this, not least the attitude of the United States. That's clear beyond any fear of peradventure. In February last year, the then Foreign Secretary said, without the US agreement to this, the deal is dead. But we've had the Commander-in-Chief, no less, in recent days saying this deal is stupid, that it is weak. There can't be any ambiguity in that. That's the contemporaneous view of our greatest partner and friend. Surely, to goodness, that's justification for pausing this. We've learnt about the Pelin-Darba Treaty. I have to say, I wasn't aware of this until very recently, but again, it's a showstopper. We've had Paul Berringer, the Deputy Prime Minister of Mauritius, recently saying there will be no nuclear weapons in Diego Garcia. He's made it very clear. He's been very helpful to the government in laying out exactly what this is going to look like when Mauritius takes control of Diego Garcia. Now, the minister says, well, we can't comment on that because it's operational. That's precisely what it is not. We're not talking about precise B-52s or Ohio-class submarines going into Diego Garcia. I don't want to know about that. What I want to know about is the legal structure within which it is possible for these things to be in Diego Garcia and Chagos in general. And of course I will.
Does he not agree with me, as a point I made earlier on to the Minister, but perhaps he could also explain this, that if the Deputy Prime Minister Mauritius, as close as yesterday, made it specifically clear, so there is, to follow the Honourable Gentleman on the other side, no ambiguity in this at all. This is clear. No nuclear weapons on Chagos by any government at all.
That is precisely the case. It is as plain as a pikestaff, and yet the government persists with this. Now, look, it's perfectly reasonable and respectable for the government to say, look, the facts have clearly changed, and all these things have come to light, and we will pause this. There's no hurry in this, and there's no dishonour in saying that we need to consult more widely on this matter. It could potentially be indefinitely, but nevertheless we will continue the process, keep it open. I appreciate, to save the government's blushes, we can't simply can it, but we can pause it. If she wants more evidence for this in relation to the Chagosians who have been trampled all over in this process, she need only refer to the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, December 25, who themselves said that we should be pausing this in order to ensure that the Chagosians' voices are properly heard. So she's being attacked from all quarters, and the unifying message from all of those quarters is, for goodness sake, let's pause this and just think again. Of course, I give way to my honourable friend.
I'm very grateful to my honourable and gallant friend for giving way. Does he agree with me that this could well be a case of, if you can keep your head while all around are losing theirs, it's possible you failed to appreciate the gravity of the situation?
Well, my honourable friend, who's very experienced in matters around this material, makes an extremely good point. We need to keep our head in all of this. This side has been consistent in its opposition to this terrible, terrible surrender deal. The people out there can't honestly understand why it is that the government persists with it. It's plainly not a matter of national security. I fear it's underpinned by the incoming government's insistence on satisfying their guilt, their post-colonial guilt, and that is really what has underpinned all of this. The government needs to get over this and understand that what has primacy in this matter, is national security. Of course, I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. I want to give him the assurance that, as a Labour Member of Parliament, I have had zero conversations with other Labour Members of Parliament about this deal being motivated by some kind of post-colonial guilt. That is absolutely not a motivation, and I want to dispel him of that impression once and for all. But he talks about consistency. Why was it that the Conservatives started negotiations, and why was it that 85% of negotiations were actually concluded under the Conservatives? Would he not agree that actually, just because the Conservatives are now out of office, they suddenly have discovered they don't need to be consistent?
The honourable gentleman for his remarks, and obviously I don't have any insight into the conversations he has with members of the Labour Party. In relation to negotiations, as a former Foreign Office Minister, I would say there are negotiations and there are negotiations. And sometimes negotiations can be used as a tool for keeping certain parties happy whilst having no intention of agreeing to what they are demanding of you. And I would say further to that, that a lot of the pressure for all of this comes from this advisory note from the ICJ. Now, judges in this country, Madam Deputy Speaker, we think of as upstanding, impartial maintainers of our legal system and the rule of law. It isn't necessarily the case when it comes to supranational judicial bodies. We know, for example, that Patrick Robinson, one of the judges involved with the ICJ's decision in 2019, has been demanding that this country pony up with £19 trillion in slavery reparations. These are not apolitical, independent judicial figures, and many of them have an agenda, and it's an agenda that is hostile to this country. I would say as hostile as some of the parties that we are currently trying to prevent getting a hold on these islands, like Russia and like China. And it is perfectly reasonable for the President of the United States, who I have to confess is not my cup of tea, deciding belatedly but nevertheless that this is a disastrous measure and that he wants nothing to do with it. He has signalled that in his own inimicable fashion. This government should take note. This government should pause this surrender treaty, come back with something better, if at all. But this surely is as dead as the dodo.
John Slinger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And before I turn my remarks to the Opposition Day debate, I must comment on the answer that the Shadow Foreign Secretary gave to the Right Honourable Member for Beverley and Holderness, who is an honourable member that I respect hugely. She mentioned climbing the greasy pole, I believe possibly even in relation to me. But it is always amusing when people who have served in the cabinets of multiple Conservative Prime Ministers accuse other honourable members who are on the back bench of being somehow involved in climbing a greasy pole. It's just very, very amusing. But turning to thank you. Another Right Honourable Member who also did pretty well, I understand, in the past. But addressing the Opposition Day debate, this is the Conservative Party playing politics with national security, with their friends and colleagues in the other place, using a wrecking amendment to block the British Indian Ocean Territory. Bill is being a prime example of that. Members opposite have never been able to answer the question. If there was no problem with British sovereignty and operation of the base, then why, Madam Deputy Speaker, why did they begin the negotiations in the first place? Of course I'll give way.
I'm grateful to the honourable and incredibly loyal member for giving way. Does he realise that in the result of a UN judgment in 1965, the United Kingdom was required to enter into negotiations with Argentina over the future of the Falkland Islands in 1965. And those negotiations continued until 1982,
for a long time,
when they were concluded in a rather different way envisaged by the UN.
Where the Guards played
I thank the honourable and even more loyal than I am member. I mean, we spar across the House, but he's even more honourable and gallant member for his history lesson. But it doesn't actually change the fundamentals, which are that 85%, Madam Deputy Speaker, 85% of the negotiations took place under the Conservatives. And the Right Honourable Member for Braintree, when he was Foreign Secretary, in November 2022, said that, I quote, "Through negotiations, taking into account relevant legal proceedings, it is our intention to secure an agreement on the basis of international law to resolve all outstanding issues." Close quotes. And in February 2025, a spokesperson for the Leader of the Opposition insisted that she understood negotiations over the islands were needed due to the international legal position. This is obviously political opportunism. These are Right Honourable and Honourable members of this House of Commons who raised no objections in Parliament, filed no critical questions and voiced no concerns on social media. Only after leaving government did they do so, and indeed with no plan of their own. And regarding the matter of the sovereignty of the Chagosians, the Conservatives' view is logically inconsistent. They want the UK to retain sovereignty, but they attack us for not giving the Chagosians the right to self-determination. They have ruled out resettlement. Some Chagosians want to return to Diego Garcia. Our opposition, Right Honourable and Honourable members, calling for them to be returned to that island, with the inevitable issues that would cause for the operation of the vital base. they've gone rather silent on that point. So it is political opportunity. Of course I'll give way to the Honourable Member.
To the Honourable Member, does he see any parallel between the plight of Chagosians and the plight of Greenlanders? Because the Prime Minister has gone out of his way, correctly, to defend the rights of Greenlanders, but is doing the complete reverse for Chagosians.
The issue of the sovereignty of the Chagosians is a sensitive and delicate one that we are attempting to deal with, as my honourable friend, the Minister, set out. We have established a contact group. Many meetings have taken place, and I strongly endorse those steps to give respect to the Chagosian people for what has happened to them. Now, the party opposite only used £1.6 million of the support fund for the Chagosian people, a support fund of 40 million people, which hardly indicates that when they were in office, they had the interests of the Chagosian people as their number one priority. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to make clear to the House that this is political opportunism of the worst kind. Of the worst kind, Madam Deputy Speaker, because it is regarding national security and the British national interest, and they really should not be playing party political games with that. And indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, nor should they be using language such as surrender with such abandon as the Shadow Foreign Secretary does, because it is implying things that are simply not true. It is whipping up public concern, and this is totally unnecessary, particularly when regarding the British national interest. And that is why I am very glad to be opposing this opportunistic motion before the House today, and I commend my honourable friend, the Minister, for her statement.
Dr. Kieran Mullan.
Very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the opportunity to speak today and make clear my opposition to any proposal to give away the strategically important sovereign British territory. This is not merely a territorial concession. It's an act of strategic self-sabotage, a dereliction of duty and an unforgivable betrayal of our national security. At a time of growing global instability, when our adversaries are watching for any sign of weakness, Labour has chosen to send precisely the wrong signal, that Britain can be pressured into abandoning its own territory. This decision is indefensible on every level. The Chagos Islands, and specifically Diego Garcia, have been a vital strategic asset for the UK and our allies for decades. The military base on Diego Garcia has played a crucial role in global security operations, supporting counter-terror efforts, maritime security and regional stability. It's been instrumental in projecting Western power into the Indo-Pacific region, a region increasingly shaped by geopolitical competition, particularly with China. By ceding sovereignty over these islands, Labour has put at risk Britain's own strategic interests and undermined our ability to operate in this region. What makes this decision even more staggering is that we're not just surrendering our sovereignty, we're paying Mauritius billions of pounds for the privilege. And the central concern for me is the very serious strategic challenge we face in respect of China. China is a country with a population of 1.4 billion people. Their expected GDP by 2030 is projected to be $26 trillion, and second only to the US, with potential projections that they will outstrip them by 2050. China's increase in their military spending this year alone is expected to be at 7.2%. This would mean it is the third consecutive year that China's increase in military spending has been over 7%. China has now become the world's largest shipbuilding nation. They also expect China's Navy to reach 430 military-grade ships by 2030, compared to the US Navy's estimate decline to 294. China is a growing military power. It shows no indications that it's anywhere near a supposed peak. Domestically and internationally, they conduct themselves as an autocratic state. They have the most sophisticated domestic surveillance system in the world, referred to as Skynet, with 700 million cameras as of 2023. That's one lens for every 2 of its own citizens. We must not be so naive as to assume that if we end up in even greater strategic competition with China, that they will care at all what agreement we've reached with Mauritius. We saw with Hong Kong how easily agreements made with third countries can be ignored, as China has itself done directly there. If Mauritius seeks to align itself strategically with China, do you think China will hesitate from asking them for breaking that treaty because of international law, that they won't fit any bill or any diplomatic consequences for Mauritius if they think it's in their interest to get Mauritius to break that agreement? That is the difference between any form of agreement and sovereignty. Once sovereignty has been given away, it can never be brought back. I will give away.
And this is why some people are concerned also that even if Mauritius did allow the Americans to have nuclear weapons on the base, which I don't think they would, but if they did, then that would give China an excuse to break the same treaty to which Mauritius is already committed about a non-nuclear Africa, and China wouldn't even get the odium that it otherwise would if it started deploying nuclear weapons all over the African continent.
The member is absolutely right. I think it's extraordinary that we have a Labour MP willing to stand up on the other side and defend this deal whilst admitting they don't even know whether or not our accusations are correct. At least stand up and say you don't agree with what we're proposing. To admit you don't know whether or not we can have nuclear weapons on the island, but you're happy to support the deal anyway is disgraceful. I mean, must address the wider consequences of this decision. If Labour is willing to abandon the Chagos Islands so easily, what message does this send to our other overseas territories? And the International Court of Justice may have issued an advisory opinion in 2019 recommend. Well, it's true. The world is watching. We have been pressure put on us in relation to a sovereign territory, and we have collapsed. And they don't want us to think that the rest of the world won't take an interpretation from that. I'm happy to.
I'm really grateful because we've heard from chief ministers and leaders of the other British overseas territories how disappointed they've been in the rhetoric of the party opposite in trying to drag them in. There is no question about our commitment to the British overseas territories, and it is a completely separate matter, this deal.
We should be worried about are not the people in charge of the British overseas territories. It's the people who are watching what we do and make decisions about how they will act, as we saw, for example, with previous attempts to take control of those territories. Do you think Argentina will observe this and won't draw a lesson from it? Of course they will.
Grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. He's making a very powerful speech. Can he confirm to the House that very shortly after this deal was announced, the Argentinian government announced that they wish to renew their claim to the Falkland Islands? That is a fact, is it not?
That is a fact. And he will also note that for decades, other UN bodies have supported Argentina, and it's pressuring us to continue negotiations around that issue. So, again, the government relies on what the UN say. The UN's position on the Falklands is completely contrary to the interests of this country.
I'm grateful for giving way yet again, and the fact is that government ministers keep saying, how dare you compare this with the Falkland Islands, but it was their own manifesto at the last election that gave a commitment to defend the sovereignty of the British overseas territories. Not some of them, all of them. And if they can't be trusted on this one, then they can't be trusted on any of them.
And then it's drawing out the lessons that the rest of the world will be observing. And a submissive approach to third-party courts on these issues displays an incredible naivety about the world we live in today and the direction it's travelling in. Our previous positive disposition to these institutions could play was in a different era when we expected a converging uniformity of basic values and democracy. That convergence is not happening, and instead our enemies are using our desire to stick to it as a weakness to exploit. They don't even recognise basic legal norms and institutions in their own countries. Their own citizens don't benefit from legal protections and rights. They don't believe in the rule of law, full stop. Do they ever really think that they will put international legal obligations ahead of pursuing their own strategic interests? Of course they won't. And yet we're expected to undertake a strategic surrender in the name of the rule of law in a way that advantages them on the basis of what? That they might look at what we've done and then in future change their ways, as they failed to do in Hong Kong. It's incredible naivety.
Grateful to my honourable friend. And does it really not just prove his point that despite being signatories to the WTO, they continue, the Chinese, to steal IP?
It isn't just the WTO. Of course, they're supposed to be following the jurisdiction, for example, of the international maritime courts, that the opposition point to as the reason why we should comply with it. They breach those rulings all the time, as we discussed in relation to the South China Sea. They couldn't care less. They just are only restrained by their own strict self-interest and pretend and play at the idea that they might follow or not follow the rules. And when it doesn't suit them, they don't follow them. But then we're supposed to follow them because it's aimed at getting them on side. It's never going to happen. Sorry, Madam Day Speaker. And let's actually look at the membership of the ICJ and the people that made the ruling. The Vice President was Zhu Han-kin, who ruled that the UK should give the islands over to Mauritius. She's a former Chinese Communist Party official who serves as Director General of the Department of Treaty and Law in China's Foreign Ministry, the same ministry that's overseeing the violation of the agreement in Hong Kong. It makes absolutely no sense that we can see them as neutral arbiters. And in 2022, she's one of the 2 judges to vote against an ICJ ruling that Russia should suspend its invasion of Ukraine. Would our country, slavishly adhering to these rulings against our own national interests, bring on side wavering countries that are making their own strategic calculations about who they want to support if it comes to challenges like Ukraine and, if it happens, Taiwan? Of course it won't. The historical argument for that approach has been to suggest we will bring other countries over to our way of doing things, the rules-based order. But I'm afraid that's not happening, and what the reward is actually looking at is which bloc, which sphere of influence is best at defending their interests if they seek to align with them. And this surrender deal will make it very clear that perhaps they should think twice about supporting the Western democracies and instead point their finger towards the autocratic states that are going to benefit so enormously from this deal. Surrendering the Chagos Islands will simply strengthen those countries that want a more disorderly world. Of course we should seek to use the rules-based order. That's a long-term goal that we shouldn't abandon, and we should continue to make it clear that's our preference for how we run the world, but not with our eyes and ears closed to what's actually happening and not at huge cost to our own interests. This is not diplomacy, it's not pragmatism, it's weakness. And weakness has consequences. Britain is not just losing a territory, we are losing credibility. Our allies are watching as Labour surrenders key strategic ground without so much as a fight. Our adversaries are taking note and seeing a government that lacks the resolve to defend its own interests. Madam Deputy Speaker, this deal is a sellout and a catastrophic misjudgment. It must not go ahead. I urge every member of this House to stand firm for Britain's interests, for our national security and for our place in the world. We must reject this reckless agreement and demand that our government defends British sovereign territory, not bargaining it away behind closed doors.
Sir Alec Shelbrooke.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I think it's also worth reflecting today upon the entire geopolitical situation that the world faces. We've had many examples that many treaty states simply aren't worth the paper they're written on. And if it is to suit our adversaries to ignore them, they will ignore them. And is not the old maxim of to stop a war, be ready to fight a war, more true today than it's ever been before? And if we decide that actually we're just going to rely on pieces of paper rather than the ability to say we will defend at war if need be, that we weaken our position. Madam Deputy Speaker, let us consider the whole Indo-Pacific region. The NATO Parliamentary Assembly did a visit to Pacific Command back in August, and the Admiral of that base made it crystal clear that in a very short space of time the Americans would be outnumbered in the Pacific arena. And it is simply not going to work to limit the ability of what weapons may or may not be able to be used that are currently able to be used. There has not been a satisfactory answer in relation as to whether nuclear weapons can be stored on Diego Garcia when under the authority of the Murrissans. And despite the conversations about what P. Hesketh said, what other treaties may have said and negotiations along the way, you have the Commander-in-Chief, outranks the Defence Secretary in the US, saying, I don't want to do this deal. You have the Deputy Prime Minister of the Murrissans saying, you will not be able to hold nuclear weapons. What makes ministers so convinced that those leaders of their country are wrong and that they are right? And this is the greatest and deepest concern, because we do live in a world that is rapidly changing, not just in the disregard of the rules-based order, not just in that we are changing our energy demands, but those energy demands are shifting the geopolitical basis. And a lot of the materials that we are going to need for renewables and moving into renewable energy actually start to shift more towards these hemispheres than they do currently in the Gulf. And therefore the geopolitical positioning of the Chagos Islands becomes more and more important. It is absolutely right to say that our government started negotiations and that they went on and on and on. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, because negotiations go on and on and on, doesn't mean there is a victory in ending them overnight by just giving away to the red lines that we wouldn't cross. That is a very important point, Madam Deputy Speaker, because not recognising the situation we now face is actually worse than trying to crow that we've had some diplomatic victory. We are seeing time and time again the government kowtowing to Beijing rather than standing up to Beijing. We are seeing that today. Where is the strategic plan? Many of us, and I look at some of my honourable friends on this bench, my right honourable friend for New Forest East, was exceptionally critical of the David Cameron golden era relationships with China. These are not new things for those criticisms that may want to come forward. And he warned at the time of the security risks that China played. The Prime Minister has signed off the embassy, the super embassy, despite all of the things we know about what we've already seen in the blueprints of that embassy. And for what reason? And there just seems to be this almost pathological, but I mean this faith that the Chinese will always act in good faith, and that we can trust them, and that they wouldn't dare invade, and they wouldn't dare do these things because we signed a piece of paper. The world is changing, Madam Deputy Speaker, and there is no shame in putting a pause to negotiations when such new changes have come to light. And I think the Defence Minister today, when reflecting upon what is being said, should draw upon the reasons that are being given out of how the situation has changed since their government came to power, which is, not getting a year and a half, getting on towards 2 years. The situation has claimed incredibly in that time. I give way to my right honourable friend. I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
Just a helpful suggestion. I know I can't commit my party as a whole, but speaking personally, if the government will change their position on this, and I'm sure my honourable friend, my right honourable friend, will give a personal pledge never to accuse them of having done a U-turn on this matter. We will praise them to the skies, and we will not seek to take party political advantage of their belated acceptance of reality.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I think those... I'm grateful to my right honourable friend because I think that makes a very important point, Madam Deputy Speaker, that acting in the national interest, changes in position should be welcomed. And, for example, Madam Deputy Speaker, we are living in a situation where we do not have the defence capability that we need. And it is worrying in the extreme that to hear that the deal for Diego Garcia will be coming out of the defence budget. And we hear people say the defence budget went down and it was hollowed out, etc. It did go down, Madam Deputy Speaker, but often the bit that's missed there, that started in the Cold War. That continued through the 13 years of Labour government. It continued across Europe. The Americans halved their defence budget in that time. The world was a different place. And then we had the invasion of Ukraine. And at that point, the world changed direction. Let's just consider for a moment, Madam Deputy Speaker, two countries which have made incredibly significant, if you will, U-turns. And that is Germany, and its now defence posture, and the hundreds of billions they're going to spend on defence. And, of course, Japan. Both countries who have drawn a huge line under the events of the Second World War to recognise that the world has changed to a much more dangerous place and needs a much bigger posture. And, Deputy Speaker, I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. The point I was going to make is now slightly taken forward by the additional things that he said. And I do take the point that we live in a more insecure time to which this country has to respond. He gives the example of Germany. Germany is able to do that because its level of indebtedness has not risen so extraordinarily in recent years as our own country has. We are in deficit to the tune of 2.7 trillion and we pay £105 million in debt interest repayments every year before we pay anything else. So I do want to reflect on the fact that we're in a particularly difficult situation as a government, and I would also point out that it is due to the inheritance that we face. But the point that I wanted to make, if I may, is around the thoughtful contribution he's making, which is to move this debate into a more strategic conversation about the relationship of the UK to China. Now, in my hand, I have an iPhone, designed in California, assembled in China. I assume he has an iPhone too. Most people in this chamber would. But the point that I'm making here is we have to figure out the relationship between our two countries, where to decouple so economically, so significantly, could harm our quality of living, our trade balance and investment opportunities, while also being mindful of the threat that China faces. What is the Conservative Party's posture on the question of China?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm sure the honourable gentleman may have been tied up trying to see whether he backed Andy Burnham or not this morning. But our leader today made it very crystal clear. When asked, would she be going to Beijing now, she said no, because until there was a proper plan in place of what strategic interest that you would want to work out with colleagues in Beijing, there was no point in going along. I'm afraid, Madam Deputy Speaker, I do not believe there is much to celebrate in a trade deal with the Chinese of £600 million. It barely seemed worth the trip in itself. Let me just quickly reflect upon the levels of debt, because, again, the honourable gentleman has slightly forgotten something called a pandemic, which cost £500 billion. He has forgotten Gordon Brown's banking crisis that cost £500 billion. He has forgotten that we've gone into a war in Europe which caused 11% inflation. And I do find this very interesting dichotomy that we get from the opposition, Madam Deputy Speaker, of saying inflation was 11% under your government. Oh, but inflation's not our fault it's going up, it's because of the war in Ukraine. I think perhaps sometimes they want to marry those two sentences up. I'll give way to my little friend.
My honourable friend agreed with that every single point from 2010 onwards. All the Labour Party ever did was encourage us to spend more.
And actually, I think they've put what they've said into practice. I mean, the reality of raising £77 billion in taxes, and really, I can't see great investments going into defence. I mean, let me say this right now, Madam Deputy Speaker. I don't like the idea of percentages of GDP on defence. I think somehow along the line, NATO and its allies fell into this trap of saying we had to spend X on defence. Saying, well, we spent 5% of GDP on defence in the 1980s. Yes, we did. That's what it cost. It wasn't the target to get to. That's what it cost. We should identify what we need, and then we should fund it and spend it and see what that comes out at. And we are in a situation where the things that we say we want to fund may well not be able to be delivered if we don't properly defend ourselves. And that brings me right back to the point of today's debate, Madam Deputy Speaker, before we get too far out of the lines, is that this is about a geopolitical situation. And removing such a key capability where we cannot guarantee whether we can have those nuclear deterrents, which we have shown over decades help keep the peace. There's nobody from the SNP here today, Madam Deputy Speaker, but when they say we would never use Trident, we would never use a nuclear weapon, they miss the point that it's not a nuclear weapon, it is the nuclear deterrent, and that we have used it every single day from the day that the resolution class was launched, and that has made sure that we have kept a semblance of peace and moved away from war. And so I am deeply concerned that this debate seems to be more and more about what may be written on a piece of paper than what we actually have the capability to do today.
Dr. Luke Evans.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Chair. And I've actually enjoyed the Foreign Office in the last few weeks, and I was trying to think why I've got so much more enjoyment out of what they've been doing, because I think they've been actually taking their advice from Monty Python and the search for the Holy Grail, because every time we have a question, we have the Black Knight that comes up in front of us. Honourable, brave, doughty, won't answer a question, is torn limb from limb, struck down in their arguments one by one, but still wants to have the fight. And I applaud...
It's just a scratch. It's a flesh wound.
It is indeed. I applaud the government and the ministers for doing exactly that, because we hear time and time again from the government side is that we've had ample time to debate this. And I would entirely agree. But the problem is exactly this. The reason it's going on so long is because we're not getting the answers to the questions to be able to do our job and scrutinise this. Because if you're ever making a good argument, you should be able to justify your point, put it in place, and then evidence it from there. So if I summarise some of the key questions that I want answered and why we seem stuck here, I'm then going to explain why that matters and the context, finally, of what is going on within the debate. So first of all, we ask about the legal position, because the government says there is a legal jeopardy here. But this side contests that the ICJ is non-binding and there is not a court that could pass judgment. As well, there is a Commonwealth opt-out. When it comes to the finances, the government says it is 3.4 billion. This side contests that actually the government actuary says it is 34 billion because the government is using the wrong tool to make the judgment, because net present value does not count. When it comes to the environment, the government says there are securities there, but we contend on this side that Mauritius does not have a navy to be able to hold up its side of the bargain to prevent damage to the fishing. When it comes to the nuclear aspect, we on this side recognise that the Pelindaba Treaty is brought into conflict here, yet the government hasn't explained why it isn't. When it comes down to the US involvement, whether or not they have a veto, we have the 1966 agreement that we believe on this side would need to be taken into account. And finally, it hasn't been mentioned today and in the last few weeks, but we talk about the long-term security of this base. At the end of 99 years, there's only an option for us to buy and continue. So what happens at this point? We haven't secured the long-term nature of the base whatsoever.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. He, like me, will have heard the Minister for the Indo-Pacific listing the preconditions before treaty ratification can take place. And I'm pretty sure I asked about America, and she said there needed to be an exchange of letters. The current position of the American administration is that the current Chagos deal, as proposed by His Majesty's government, would be an act of great stupidity. So that seems quite a long way from getting American agreement and acquiescence to a position where they are comfortable. So does he, like me, foresee that this may indeed involve quite a protracted period of negotiation with the United States of America, quite rightly, in order to get their acquiescence to this deal?
Well, fundamentally, they should have and have now expressed their concerns publicly. And this is the question that we put to the Minister both today in this debate and on Monday, to try and establish whether or not the UK government can make a unilateral decision without amending the notes. Now, the government has turned around and said it has to amend the notes, but hasn't set out what happens if the US do not agree. That is the key part to this, and the government keep reading out the same answer that I got on Monday when I asked this question, the same answer I got when I intervened from the Minister, and the same answer when it was asked from behind me again, to say that we have set out the process, primary legislation, secondary legislation, and then amendments to the notes. The question is, what happens if the Americans do not agree to that amendment of the 1966 notes? What happens then? I'll take an intervention if the Minister can tell us, because that is the fundamental point when it comes to US involvement, because if they say no but we say yes, where do these islands go? What happens to the agreement? What if they say yes and we say no? What happens at that point? These are the fundamental questions why we keep coming back, because if there was clarity and simple answers to simple questions, we would understand that on this side and be able to make a balanced judgment. But we have gaps in the understanding from the government.
My honourable friend's making an excellent speech, but I think he knows what the answers to these questions, these simple questions, are. The answer to the question about whether Mauritius would be able to stop us having nuclear weapons stored on Diego Garcia is clearly that they would be able to stop us doing it, and it's quite clear that the answer to the question of what happens if the Americans say no to changing the 1966 agreement is that this deal to get rid of our sovereignty over the Chagos Islands is dead in the water. Yeah. But the reason why ministers won't say those things, even though they know it to be true, is that they're fearful of a headline saying, Minister admits that Chagos surrender can't go ahead without American agreement, even though they know that that's the case, but they're afraid of the headline.
I think my honourable friend is exactly right and entirely right on pinpointing some of the issues. So I'm going to reverse my speech and deal with some of these issues first. So if we start with Pelindaba Treaty from 1996, formally ratified in 2009, Article 4 is the key part for me, because although the whole treaty is about where you can research what you can do with nuclear weapons, Article 4 is the prevention of device parking nuclear explosives. Point 1 of it says each party undertakes to prohibit the parking of nuclear explosive devices on its territory. So therefore, by definition, if the base goes across to Mauritius, it is under the treaty because Mauritius is a signatory. But our side is slightly misconstrued because there is actually a carve-out specifically, because point 2 says, and I quote, without prejudice to the purposes and objectives of this treaty, each of the parties in the exercise of their sovereign rights may decide at its discretion to authorise the visit of foreign ships or aircraft to its ports and airports and transit, and it goes on. Yeah, so what it's implying and what it says specifically is that Mauritius would have to be consulted and provide permission for nuclear craft, be it submarine, be it boat or be it aircraft, would have to get explicit permission, which we've already heard only yesterday it would not be granted.
Very good. Very good.
So there it is, and that's the question when it comes to security about the nuclear aspect that is unanswered. And I look forward to the government trying to rectify that position, because at the moment they have not explained how there is an interaction. And this is not operational, it is purely legal text.
I thank the honourable member for giving way and for giving his excellent speech, which frankly contains more detail in it than the government's own position. In a nutshell, in conclusion, isn't this the fundamental problem that when you give away British sovereign territory to another nation, whatever agreement you have that sits around it, you are vulnerable in perpetuity for that agreement to be torn up, disagreed with and not implemented?
Absolutely, because at the end of the day you have signed that treaty. So again, the Minister on a technicality is right to say that the current treaty in front of us has no problems. But it's the interaction with the other treaties when you've given sovereignty away, because it's right, you're right. My honourable friend is right. It would not be covered because it no longer belonged to us. And that is a real difficulty the government is struggling to explain. I will take further.
I'm sorry, I must just tweak what my honourable friend just said then. The fact is that although there is that discretion for the Mauritian government to give permission for a nuclear-armed vessel, for example, to visit temporarily, there is no discretion for nuclear weapons to be stored permanently at Diego Garcia.
Absolutely, again, he's right. I think he's referring to Article 3 from memory that explicitly says in terms of also researching, etc. So the government needs to set out the interaction of that treaty and the implications with regards to the treaty it is currently signing or wanting us to ratify. But let's step back a little bit further, because we're in this position because the government argues there was a non-binding ICJ judgment. So I ask the Minister again, which court does he believe there would be a problem here with? Because we've heard from the government time and time again that there are several courts that could be brought into conflict here. The Defence Secretary was worried about UNCLOS and the International Tribunal Law of the Sea. But we already know from 2015, in a ruling against the UK when it came to Mauritius, that actually they cannot judge sovereignty. So that one's out of the window. The Minister, and I asked her about this, also mentioned the 2021 Special Chamber of the International Tribunal of the Sea. But as the Minister will know, the UK was not party to give information to that, and it rested on the non-binding judgment of the ICJ, which is already contested because we on this side do not believe there is a court and there is an opt-out because it's a Commonwealth interaction. And the government, months on, still can't answer these simple questions. But there is another court that is often used as well, and we'll go around this again, which is the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union. But we also know from the government's own written questions that Article 48.1 says you cannot judge sovereignty. So the government knows this. I don't understand why it won't just stand here and say that.
And be upfront about it.
So when it comes to finances, there's a lot of contest about where these figures are, what they are, and what they're made up of. And the government is right on its figure. The opposition is right on its figure. So how can this be? Well, it's because of the mechanism in which you're using to judge that value. So we on this side contest that the best way to do it is the nominal value which is used by the government actuaries, because it's over 100 years and you have to take into account what things will look like and factors from there. The government actuaries say it is £34 billion. Yet the government is using net present value, which does give you £3.4 billion. I'm glad the Defence Minister's here because I posed this to him in the last debate and his answer was, well, it's in the Green Book. And I retorted to him, can he give any other deal when it comes to giving away sovereignty that uses net present value? Because as he will know, I will give way.
I'm grateful to him. I ran a department that spent its whole time looking at net present value at the Department of Welfare. So my question really is, the key problem with this is you don't use net present value when you're dealing with a foreign country for a very simple reason. You have no idea what social issues will erupt or change, whereas you have control in the UK, you do not have control in a foreign country. That immediately distorts the nature of the amount of payment, plus it strips out relevant inflation, which also makes it so much officially cheaper. £34.7 billion by the actuaries is the real cost that we have to bear, not this nonsense of net present value.
Well, I entirely agree, and he's been through that experience of running a department, which I find it all the more frustrating that ministers can't simply set out the difference between the two values, because if I as a backbencher can spot it and explain it, the question is, which is the better tool and why? And actually, when it comes to net present value, it is a domestic use. So that's why the ONS won't come out and say there's a problem with it, because it's a legitimate tool to use. It's being used inappropriately when we're dealing with sovereignty. Because the assumptions they build it on are 3.5% for the first 30 years, but of course this is a 99-year lease. So we don't even know what happens at those 70 years. And if you compare it to other countries, the US used 7% as a valuation when it comes to dealing with the social discount rate. So these are simple questions that we are posing, doing our job on this side of the benches, trying to get answers from the ministers as to why you would use this. Because when you take it all into account, if you use simply inflation adjusted, it's 10 billion. So there are three figures out there that are all correct, but all stand to be used in a different way. And the fact that a minister repeatedly can't answer those questions is of due concern to us on this side of the House. If we turn to the environmental aspect, environmental aspect, it's been pointed out multiple times, Mauritius don't have a navy or a force to protect the Blue Planet part, the Blue programme that is in place. And actually, why am I concerned about that? Well, we know from the 2015 UNCLOS tribunal that took place was all about the fact that the UK wanted to put more protections in, but the Mauritians wanted fishing rights in the area. So we already have history of the fact that fishing will want to happen in that area, and yet we don't have a navy now to enforce it. This is a simple question for the government to answer. How will it resolve that problem? I will give way.
And therefore, does my honourable friend share this concern that clearly, if this deal is to go ahead, there will be need for more navy, which is expensive, and yet at the end of the day, the budget increases we're being told are in the defence budget are actually being used to pay for this ridiculous deal?
Well, quite possibly, although we already know that the FCDO have their Blue Planet programme to help protect environmental areas that were under British control or are under British control. So whether it comes under the FCDO budget as well, we simply don't know the answer to these questions. Again, very simple questions a year on in that we've been asking for. On the matter of the Chagossians, my honourable friend raised this principle, and this is a really simple one. Again, I'm confused by the government because the Prime Minister himself has said Greenlanders will decide for Greenland, yet Chagossians can't decide for Chagos. I can understand there could be an argument one way or the other, but the government won't seem to make it. It doesn't seem to see the illogical nature of what they are putting forward when they make one statement in reference to sovereignty in one area, yet not in the case that we are discussing here today. And finally, I will give way.
Does my honourable friend agree with me that for British Chagossians, they will be given no say over how a trust fund is to be spent, and that it is simply wrong that they are being given no opportunity to have any of their own personal say on the things that are going to affect them and their futures?
Absolutely, and again, this is a question for the government to answer as to why not, and set out the reasons and rationale. That's a perfectly sensible question to pose to the government. And I'm still concerned, when we're dealing with the detail, of the long-term nature of this deal, because it does look bomb-proof to me. So when we come to the end of 99 years, what happens? The only protection we have is that we have first say on taking it on. We've already heard in the debate earlier from both sides of the House, actually, just how much China's economy is going to be in growing. So therefore, are we going to even have the finances to be able to buy that deal? Will we be outbid by the US, by China, by some other brick power, maybe? So we're held over a barrel by the Mauritians. Or worse still, the Mauritians can simply say, we don't want it anymore. And the base is gone. And we can do nothing about it. Well, why does all this matter? So these are all the technical questions that I want the government to answer. But overall, we have to see the wider context, and it's been explained multiple times here before. The US is changing its foreign policy. China is changing its foreign policy. And yet the UK doesn't appear to have an approach in either way. It appears we're looking towards a sphere of influence, with America having one side, China and Russia having another. So the question is for this House, why rush this through? Why not think about it? Why not answer these simple questions to get this side of the House on board, to be able to then say, we think this is the right thing for the country? Because the saddest thing about this whole debate is how the government has turned this into scapegoating this side of the House as if we're playing political games, rather than seeing these simple technical questions that need to be answered are the key to unlocking our understanding. Because if we as parliamentarians can't get answers to these questions and don't simply understand the rationale, how can we explain it to our constituents, and how can we explain it to the nation, and how can we explain it to the world? So my ask is for the government here, if they want us to stop supposedly playing politics, answer simple questions with the simple answers, back them up, evidence them, because otherwise we are left fighting the Black Knight, who is brave, who is forthright, who is keen to stand in the way of any progress, but simply won't answer a question and is cut down limb by limb in a pool of blood.
Order, order. I will now announce the result of today's deferred division on the Draft Medical Devices Fees Amendment Regulations 2026. The ayes were 294, the noes were 108, so the ayes have it. I now call Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm going to try and keep my my words brief, because so much of this has already been laid out by my colleagues, so I see no reason why I can't repeat it. In essence, this whole thing falls onto a couple of stools, but there are some intervening issues here. I say to the honourable gentleman who we've been to Ukraine together, and I have a very high regard for him, and the government should ought to put him on their front bench as soon as possible, because he'll make less of a mess of it than the others. But I simply say to him, well, it's a compliment. Having been in government myself, I have to tell you that's quite a compliment.
It's all over now.
Ministers go. But anyway, I say this because he talked about ambiguity, quite rightly, sometimes determined ambiguity, and sometimes inadvertent ambiguity. We have the situation in the South China Seas where China has, against international law and condemned by the UN absolutely and clearly. They have no right to that area at all, historic or otherwise. But the Chinese have ignored that and are now putting defensive forts in the area. We've seen the Chinese now threaten the Philippines to barge their boats out of the way, to fire shots over them, and the same goes for Vietnam, who all lay a certain amount of claim to the area. But they've ignored all that. They're threatening Taiwan, and the one thing they do want to do is to extend that position out to the trade routes. If the Chinese government can get control of the trade routes going east-west, which, strangely enough, flow right past the Chagos Islands, then that would be an absolute win for them, so they would be able to choke the trade going east-west at any time they wish. And if people think, well, they wouldn't do that, would they? Oh, yes, they would. They are talking about now blockading Taiwan as a part of that process. So I know he's a realist, and on that basis, I simply say we need to look at the Chagos Islands and to look at this treaty in light of the threat to the free world that is growing in plain sight by this unbelievably brutal but enormous growing power. And it's worth reminding ourselves that the Chinese are building a navy which even US experts accept will outgrow the US naval forces within 2 years. And this is really important. Any one shipyard in China today builds more naval ships than the whole of the United States of America and probably Europe as well. And they have many naval shipyards. So the threat, I'll give away.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend. Something I didn't touch on. I spoke about the naval problem, but also China have built an incredible number of ICBM silos. They're hugely increasing their nuclear arsenal. They refuse to come to the table for negotiations on non-proliferation treaties. Is it not the most ridiculous time that you would give up the certainty of being able to house nuclear weapons at a strategic site?
Well, I'm going to come on to this, and he's right. I just wanted to set the background information about what the problem is. The problem is China. And China, remember, supports Russia. So the very idea that a British citizen, Philippe Sands, in this case representing British, actually negotiates and talks to the Russians about how this would not make it difficult for them to hold on to Crimea is astounding to me. To even engage with them on this is astonishing as well. So that tells you that the nature of some of those people involved in this is really questionable indeed. And so the background is, what is the threat? And the threat is greater than it has been, you could argue now, I think, at any time since the Second World War, and certainly now since the end of the Cold War. We are in a new environment, and that new environment requires us to understand the nature of our assets and how we would maximise those assets, not minimise them.
Yes.
So my argument here is slightly different. It is, we have taken the wrong decision over Chagos for the wrong reasons. If we had stepped back and asked ourselves in 10 years, 5 years' time, or even in 2 years' time, when China is estimated to have a more powerful fleet in the Pacific than the US can muster at any stage, then really would we say that we ought to let the Chagos Islands go and put in the hands of Mauritius? Mauritius, who China lauds in almost every announcement that it makes, and has a very good relationship with it. Okay, I'm with you.
And actually, even if we accept the government position that Mauritius don't get on particularly well with China, are we really resting in the hands of fate that they might change their minds 50 years from now and seek to line up with their sphere of influence? It's a huge gamble to take.
He's absolutely right, and I agree with him fundamentally. And I'm sorry, in a way, today that the Right Honourable Member for Cardiff South and Penarth is not here. Not that I have any particular view, detrimental view of the Right Honourable Gentleman who's there now, forgive me, but I worry why he isn't here. I hope he's not suffering from long Chagos, and therefore maybe we should send him a get-well card very soon. We miss him. Because that is definitely studied ambivalence at the dispatch box as a master plan, I'm sure of it. But I simply say now, On this treaty, we know now, because of yesterday, it's been said by a number of colleagues, and I just repeat it here, that we know now, yesterday, if we needed to know it at all, that the Deputy Prime Minister of Mauritius has made it categorically clear, categorically clear, there will be no allowance for nuclear weapons either parked or landed on the islands of Chagos while this treaty exists and while they have that. Now, I don't know about studied ambivalence, which the honourable gentleman did talk about quite rightly. I didn't think there was any ambivalence about his statement. He's completely clear, and yet we are ambivalent. And ambivalence for us is a mistake because it allows the statements of fact to be presented by those who will take control of Chagos. That is not just a mistake, but a disastrous mistake. I think my honourable friend wants to give it.
I think there's a further twist on this, because it's not only that the Pelindaba Treaty prohibits the storing of nuclear weapons on the territory of Mauritius, which the Chagos Islands would become, but the treaty requires an inspection regime.
Yes.
And the country, I understand, which would be carrying out the inspection is South Africa. And South Africa is somewhat closer to China and Russia, particularly where naval cooperation is concerned, than it is towards America or the United Kingdom.
My right honourable friend is absolutely right, as he normally is. And the reality is that this treaty that he refers to is very clear about those who are signatories to it. They have no choice to modify it. They must agree categorically not to have nuclear weapons on their territory. And we are in the business of giving that territorial right over to Mauritius, so therefore it will apply to Chagos. No question at all. And that brings me also to the other bit which the government simply doesn't seem to face up to, is that this arrangement or treaty in 1966 between the USA and the UK absolutely is clear, and I want to quote this. It states what the government calls an exchange of letters, but this is actually a treaty. So it obfuscates it when you talk about an exchange of letter. It sounds like a get well card or something that you put in the post. Oh, it's not a big problem. We just exchange a few letters to each other. How are you? Getting on fine. What about us? We're just going to give the islands away. Are you okay with that? We're okay with that. No problems. Can you give us a bit more detail? We will when it's all passed. Don't worry about it. We'll be with you on this. No, it is a treaty. It has the substance of being a treaty. And the substance of that treaty states categorically, the territory shall remain under the United Kingdom sovereignty. Now, we can't arbitrarily change that. We have to have full agreement from the USA that that is the case. And I do not believe now that the United States really understood that the nature of this was that they wouldn't have sovereign rights over the base. And I don't think the government ever even bothered to explain it, because I seem to recall that when this whole debate began, this was never mentioned. Not one moment did the government come forward and say, yes, we're going to get this bill through, but look, it's not in the bill, but I tell you what, we'll exchange letters with you afterwards, because although it's relevant and it's completely sovereign, we don't want to talk about it. So the government has to explain, when the minister gets to his feet, why they never made any significant mention of this at all. Because this has a massive bearing on now what happens to this really poor treaty, badly drafted, hurriedly written, and only of a few pages long. I have to tell you, I sat through the Maastricht Treaty, we're rebelling, of course, but the reality was, throughout all of that, it was huge. And every aspect of our arrangements was in there and debatable and amendable. It has been horrific to watch how fast the government wants to get this through. And I honestly say that this is madness. And I just want to come quickly to the cost. The other bit that is completely wrong is the government's desire to show how little they've had to pay for this to get what they consider to be a reasonable lease. The government's now moving against leaseholders. Isn't it ironic here in the UK? They do not like leases. Apparently there are not enough power over those leases. And I simply say to the government, I say, learn from your own views about what's happening domestically. The lease is a terrible thing at times because it gives you so little control. This is going to be a least. I will, of course.
He's making an excellent speech, and if he were not already sanctioned by the Chinese, he would be by the end of it. Does he recall that Disraeli said in opposition that we may not win the vote tonight, but we can win the argument? And does he agree with me that we are not only winning the argument, but the government are failing by not answering any questions to make any actual argument at all?
Indeed. In fact, I would say that rather than us winning the argument, the government has simply lost the argument, which is even, in a way, more powerful because they're making no effort to explain it. And I feel sorry, honestly, for the ministers. I've sat in government and, you know, you're sent out to bat and to defend the indefensible, and you have to do it well. And I'd say to the honourable gentleman that I have a high regard for him, as he knows, and good luck on this one tonight. But in fact, he'll need to make it brief because we will intervene. I simply say, though, that the cost is nonsense. And my honourable friend brilliantly laid it out. So I won't repeat the specifics, but I will simply say, as I said to him, having sat in government, and I know how these figures are put together, and there is no way on earth that a government should rightly use net present value for a foreign treaty over a period of over 90 years. It is an absurdity. We have no control over their social obligations in Mauritius. They may shift them and change them. We have no control over what their economic policy will be, thus inflation in this. We have no control over that. It can only really be used for domestic issues. And I think this is a shimmy by the government to try and get the cost down, absurdly, to 3.4 billion, when in fact it's 34.7. And that's probably wrong. I think it's probably wrong because I think it will be more than that over the long term. So this is another absurdity and an excuse to be got rid of. And I want to end on this one particular point, which is, as all the other points have been made, and I won't dwell on them, but I do want to dwell on this. It was wrong in 1966 when we chucked the Chagossians off their island. It was a bad decision. It was an immoral decision. And governments make this, and we need to own up to that fact. My government should have done, and I think we should today own up to this fact, that we owe the Chagossians something better. Now, the Right Honourable Gentleman speaks for the Liberal Democrats, has talked about a referendum. I absolutely think that's one of the possibilities. But I tell you what I would do if I was in government. I'd say, listen, we're not going to do the deal with Mauritius. We'll do the deal with you, the Chagossians, over the islands. And you will be allowed back to those islands with full rights, and we'll negotiate with you how we work together with British control overall, but with you being paid. I'd rather pay that money to them so they can live their lives better than do Mauritius. And we know, by the way, that Chagossians, many of them had terrible problems in Mauritius, have been treated like second-class citizens. Right. We know that the United Nations Committee on Racial Discrimination has come out and said this treaty should not go ahead for those reasons. And I agree with that. So there is both a factual problem with this and a human rights problem, and overarching all, a threat to the freedom of ourselves and those in the free world. And if we give way on this, if we let this go through, if we do not correct, change and end the nonsense of this, we will forever have that over our heads as you lost control of the most critical area in the world.
Andrew Rossingdale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very pleased that I am following my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford and Woodford Green. I only wish that when he was the leader of the Conservative Party, he then got on to become Prime Minister, because we wouldn't be sitting here today debating this issue. His last words of his speech just given said everything that needed to be said. All governments of all political parties have failed to do the right and moral thing over many decades. The Chagos Islands were depopulated, cruelly depopulated, and the people of the Chagos Islands were never given any say or any right of self-determination. Had that happened, decolonisation would have taken place, and there would never have been an international court ruling. The Chagos would have stayed British, and they would have proudly, as the Falkland Islands and the Gibraltarians have done, they would have voted in any referendum to exercise their right of self-determination and stay British. But all governments of all parties ignored the whole issue for decades, despite all the appeals of a small number of us that tried again and again and again, but were ignored. And so that is why we are in the position we are today. But I cannot disagree with almost anything of my former colleagues have been saying today about this issue. They've analysed it correctly. I only wish in the 14 years we had done something about it at that stage. And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, I won't at this stage. And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, as all members, I think, on all sides of the House will know, there have been few issues that have consumed so much of my parliamentary life in 25 years as the British Indian Ocean Territory, Chagos Islands, and, more importantly, the Chagosian people. For more than 2 decades, I have fought for the Chagosian right of self-determination, as with all overseas territories and former colonies. I chaired the British Indian Ocean Territory all-party parliamentary group. In fact, I was the deputy chairman to the right honourable member for Islington North. So it's a bit of a juggling act in trying to get cross-party consensus about where we're heading on that. But the one thing that united that all-party group was the belief that the Chagosians should have the right of resettlement. And I argued strongly that ultimately self-determination, whatever the options are, the Chagosians make the final say, whatever happens. The Honourable Member for Islington North had a different view, but 7 political parties represented in that group came to the view that the first thing is resettlement, but the Conservative government over 14 years absolutely refused to even consider any option for resettlement of those islands. So I dealt with this issue also as a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee over 15 years. And unlike many who now speak with great certainty, they remained silent during that period, but I did not. And I've also been there. I've been to the British Indian Ocean Territory. I've walked those islands. I've seen the abandoned churches and schools. I've walked around the ancestral graves of the Chagosian people, the derelict homes, and the visible traces of a community expelled from its homeland and denied the right to return. And I've asked every minister, every government over and over again. I've been ignored, and a small number of us were ignored as well. I pay tribute to the former members Daniel Kaczynski, Shrewsbury, he raised it, and Henry Smith in Crawley. We all raised it, but over 14 years, sadly, the last government just dismissed it and refused to even consider it. I went to Peros Banos. They're the outer islands. They're 160 miles away from Diego Garcia. There's no security threat there. It took me get on 4 different boats to get to these outer islands. And people could live there with no issues whatsoever. Long, long way from Diego Garcia. And the Americans, despite the line from the Foreign Office, I went to the State Department, I raised it directly, and they said, we have no objections to the Chagosians living in the outer islands. It's our Foreign Office puppeteering this policy for years, and our ministers just went along with it, did nothing, ignored the facts. I went to Mauritius in 2002, accompanied by my right honourable friend, former leader of the Conservative Party, Michael Howard, Lord Howard of Folkestone, and it wasn't part of the official programme, wasn't part of it, but I said, please, can we go and visit the Chagosians in Port Louis? And after a bit of a flurry from officials, in the end we insisted and we went to meet leaders of the Chagosian community. And that was 2002. It was pretty much my first year as a Member of Parliament. And so when I speak about Chagos, I do so from long experience, having visited Diego Garcia, the outer islands, as I've mentioned, and I conclude that this represents, by all parties sadly, a shameful betrayal of the loyal British Chagosian people. And the bill the government is putting forward is nothing short of a surrender. It hands away British sovereignty over a territory we have administered for more than 2 centuries. It binds generations of British taxpayers to a grotesque financial settlement, tens of billions of pounds paid to a foreign government simply
so that we may have lease back on the military base that we already own. That is vital to our security, and that is one of our closest allies, and yet we are prepared to risk that vital military and security base for the next century because of this shabby deal. And so ministers justify this capitulation by sheltering behind so-called international law. They insist that a non-binding advisory opinion of a court whose jurisdiction is explicitly excluded from intra-Commonwealth disputes is somehow beyond negotiation. Yet at the same time, they are content to ignore the 1966 agreement between the United States and the United Kingdom, an actual binding international treaty, which states plainly it is in its very first clause that the territory shall remain under United Kingdom sovereignty. That consideration tells us everything we need to know, Madam Deputy Speaker. This was never really about international law. An act of total weakness, that is how it has been described by the President of the United States of America. And doesn't that just say everything about this government's approach? And it does all this without the consent or a genuine consultation or even the courtesy, which every other territory has been afforded, of a democratic vote for the Chagosian people themselves. Disgraceful as this bill is, it did not emerge, however, from a vacuum. For over 2 decades and 14 years, as I've mentioned, from the government backbenches, I urged the Foreign Secretary after Foreign Secretary, Minister after Minister, speaking in the lobbies, going to the Foreign Office, talking to officials, discussing it over and over again, calling them into all-party group meetings, raising it at the FAC, Foreign Affairs Committee, to talk about the Chagosians and their right of resettlement and self-determination. Ignored all the way through. I certainly give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend, as I will always regard him, having known him for the past 40 years and having known that his patriotism is beyond question, for giving way. And does he agree with me that there's a bit of a pattern here? Because the government clearly wants to do this surrender deal giveaway, and yet tries to shelter behind inconclusive, legalistic analysis. And isn't this exactly the same as the betrayal of our Northern Ireland veterans, where the government, when pressed, admits that it wanted to remove the immunity for our veterans anyway, but it still seeks to shelter behind questionable legal considerations that have not been fully tested. Why won't the government, when it wants to do these terrible things, at least have the guts to stand up and admit that that's what they want to do and that's not what they're being forced to do by lawyers whose credentials and jurisdiction are in question, to put it at its mildest?
I agree with every word my very dear and long-standing friend has said. I say to you, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I sit here on a different bench now, but I look over the chamber there and I see colleagues over there who I still agree with on most things, but I see people on that side of the chamber who, some of whom, and certainly some of whom in government today, seem to hate everything about this country and want to undermine this country. And this is the Northern Ireland veterans, and this particular issue over the surrender of one of His Majesty's territories against the wishes of the people is exactly what I'm talking about. And I will certainly give way to my friend.
I thank him for giving way. Both he and I have visited the Falkland Islands, although on different occasions. Would he agree that there is a strategic runway and base there at RAF Mount Pleasant? Would he agree with me that what the government are doing is analogous to paying Argentina £35 billion to rent back that base in the Falkland Islands, which also belong to us and wish to be British?
Well, my right honourable friend is completely right, and there is a precedent here. The Falkland Islands could have gone the same way. Gibraltar could have gone the same way, and if we indeed they tried to do so. In 2002, one of the biggest campaigns I've ever fought was against the joint sovereignty plan by Tony Blair, again against the wishes of the Gibraltarian people. And I commend the Speaker of the House of Commons, who I worked with very closely at that time, working to keep Gibraltar British, as we did in 1982 to keep the Falkland Islands British, but it's always on the basis of self-determination. I will make some progress if I may. And so, with assurances of the United States and with precedents around the world where indigenous people live alongside military installations, I tabled an urgent question in 2016, calling for exactly that. The response from the then Conservative Foreign Office Minister, Sir Alan Duncan, was this. And he said, and I quote, "We do not consider that the right of self-determination actually applies to the Chagossians." That is what he said at the time. Madam Deputy Speaker, what a colossal disgrace. Sir Alan compared Chagossian resettlement to Pitcairn. Another British community the Conservative government at that time was willing to discard to another nation, even though Pitcairn later proved strategically vital for our accession to the CPTPP. And I'm sad to say that the government is correct, that it was the government at the time, my government, Conservative government at the time, that began this scandal, conducting 11 rounds of negotiations with Port Louis. And I commend Lord Cameron, who ended those talks, and rightly so, but they should never have begun in the first place. But I do say, why did my former party not repudiate that whole policy entirely afterwards? Why didn't they say, that's the end of it, never again, and repudiate the failure to give self-determination from Sir Alan Duncan before? Why didn't we jettison that entire policy? We didn't do so. Even from within the Shadow Foreign Affairs team, I argued very strongly that the policy was fundamentally and morally wrong, and that self-determination must be central to our response, but I was, Madam Deputy Speaker, shut down. Opposition to this bill, I'm afraid, does not come from principle of convenience. The cost of this surrender is indeed eye-watering and has been the focus of the opposition for the last year, but no amount of money compares to the dishonour of selling out of British people. Self-determination is fundamental to everything I believe in. So fundamental, in fact, that it rendered my position as a shadow minister untenable. But I am pleased to hear the words of self-determination now being used from the Shadow Foreign Secretary earlier, because when I've asked for this in the past, I've been told that's not the party policy. So I am thrilled if now, at long last, self-determination for the Chagossian people is official party policy. I hope that is the case, because then everything I've been fighting for the last 25 years has been worth it. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill and its origins under both this Labour government and the previous Conservative government represents the moment that I had enough over this issue and needed to say clearly that country has to come before party. And I believe the Chagossians deserve the same democratic rights as every other British citizen. And that is why I was genuinely horrified and upset a few weeks ago to be prevented, on Conservative Whip's instruction at the time, from voting for the amendment tabled in this House by the Honourable Member for Surrey Heath, who is a fine addition to this House and has campaigned wonderfully for the rights of the Chagossian people. And his amendment sought to guarantee a referendum for the Chagossian people. And I went to the door and I was told I cannot go in and vote for it. And I apologise to my Chagossian friends that I let them down on that, but I was told not to. And I felt deeply upset that I didn't do so. And I made it clear to the Honourable Member for Surrey Heath that he had my support and still has my support in what he was proposing. Meanwhile, genuine opposition on the benches from which I speak today has put aside party squabbles, because national interest must always come before party, and they backed the Liberal Democrat amendment. There's not really much in common usually between Reform and Liberal Democrats, but on this it's a matter of principle. So my colleagues voted, in my new party, voted for the Honourable Member for Surrey Heath's amendment, and I commend them for that. It asks simply to give a displaced people the right of consent before their homeland is gift-wrapped and donated to a foreign country. That's all we're asking. Let the people decide. Who can seriously disagree with that principle? And so we rightly insist on self-determination for the Falkland Islanders. We strongly uphold it for Gibraltar, and we defend it for every other British overseas territory and former colony, and the government is happy to support this principle over Greenland, it seems, but not for their own British Chagosian people. It makes no sense, and it's morally reprehensible. And what took place in the House of Lords at third reading was, I believe, shameful. Peers repeatedly called for a division. Shouts of not content were heard again and again, yet the House was denied the opportunity to vote. A bill of immense constitutional, financial and strategic consequence, one of the most important pieces of legislation of this Parliament, was nodded through on a procedural manoeuvre, squandering a chance to kill it. And I was further disturbed to learn from many Conservative peers who contacted me very angry that they had been instructed not to vote the bill down, not because the arguments were weak, not because the numbers were lacking, but because of a quiet understanding that sovereignty should not be defended too robustly today, lest it cause inconvenience for tomorrow. Many members of the House of Lords contacted me absolutely in despair at the instructions they were given by the whips in the Lords. So this is not coming from me, because I'm not in the Lords, but those who are there were deeply upset by that. And that, Madam Deputy Speaker, crossed the line for me. A Conservative government denied the principle of self-determination. And this Labour government has gone further, much further, surrendering the homeland entirely without any consent of the Chagosian people. This, I'm afraid to say, is a bipartisan failure. This legislation sells out the King's Islands, binds future generations to vast financial liabilities, and ignores the rights of an exiled people. I could not in good conscience remain silent or complicit, disarmed of any meaningful say in the deliberations of my former party, and in fact ashamed that the party of Margaret Thatcher, the party that took back the Falkland Islands in defence of the principle of self-determination, would be implicated in this betrayal. Perhaps the Prime Minister will keep to the word of his own Deputy Prime Minister, who stated on ITV in February that if President Trump doesn't like the deal will not go forward.
I'm sure the honourable gentleman is aware of pressures of time, and I'm sure that he'll be bringing his remarks to a conclusion shortly. Andrew Rossingdale.
Just announce the
So given the President believes this deal to be a, quote, act of great stupidity, perhaps the Prime Minister should show some courage, withdraw this legislation and scrap this atrocious deal altogether. Madam Deputy Speaker, in conclusion, it should be cast into the dustbin of history where it belongs, mark an end to this government's policy of managed decline, and prove that when it comes to the sovereignty of people over their homeland, whether it be Chagos, the British Indian Ocean Territory, or any other territory that is being decolonised around the world, it is the people themselves who must decide, have the final say, and be given the right of self-determination.
Members should be aware that I'm planning to start front bench contributions at 3:40. So I call Lincoln Jopp.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the member for Romford, and with his last words echoing in my ears of self-determination, I have no doubt that he will be reflecting on whether he is going to afford the people of Romford the same rights that he is demanding for the Chagosian people. Well, I'm pretty time constrained, but of course I will.
The opposition benches have made arguments against the government's position, and they've done that believing what is right. They've never impugned the patriotism or the loyalty of this party to our country, unlike the member opposite. Would he agree with me that we should take no lessons from Reform, who take their line from either Musk or Moscow?
I thank the honourable and gallant member for his honourable intervention. If he wants to, I suggest he takes it outside, as they say. I'm very time constrained, but I do want to pay tribute to the members on these benches who have informed this debate today as the result of incredibly detailed research and knowledge. And I have been delighted to see the Minister's PPS running backwards and forwards from the box, because I was rather hoping that the summing up was simply not going to be a reheating of the Minister for Indo-Pac's opening remarks, because there have been some substantive points made from these benches which I hope are going to be answered in the summing up. I'm very time constrained. A lot of the points have been covered, so I was wondering for inspiration as to what I might add to the debate. And so I'm simply going to read out a piece of casework which I have domestically, which, although not relevant to the Chagos Islands, I think is an interesting comparator. It comes from a member of the public who had written to his bank manager, and I suppose I owe it to him to anonymise him, so I need to come up with some sort of pseudonym. So I'm just going to call him Mr. Powell, okay? And Mr. Powell wrote to his bank manager, and he said, "Dear Sir, a number of years ago, I inherited a large 7-storey home in Mayfair. I am incredibly lucky, and I acknowledge that fact. It is far too big for me to live in. I live solely in half of the ground floor, and for as long as I can remember, I have had Americans living in the other floors. And I like these Americans, and so they live there rent-free. And so what I am proposing, sir, is that I give you, the bank, this house, and then I propose to pay you, the bank, rent above the market rent for not only me, but all the Americans who live upstairs." And so
not Mauritius, not Mauritius.
I would be very grateful for your advice on this issue. And the bank manager wrote back to Mr. Powell. He said, "Dear Mr. Powell, are you okay? I am concerned for your mental state, because what you are proposing would appear to be," and he put this bit in inverted commas, "an act of great stupidity," unquote. He made the following 4 points. He said, "Firstly, you don't need to do this at all. Secondly, it's going to cost you a fortune. Thirdly, you do realise that when you've that you will have given your house away at the end of all this. And fourthly, on a personal note, were these arrangements ever to become public, I fear that your neighbours would laugh at you." Yours, the bank manager. And so I will simply leave that analogue there, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let my colleagues come in and so we can wrap this up.
Well done.
Superb. Apple Branbury.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On every level, this is a bad deal. From the absurdity of paying £34.7 billion for the privilege of ceding our own territory, to the implications for defence, from putting at risk one of the most pristine marine environments in the world, to the complete disregard shown to the British Chagosians themselves. There is so much I could focus my remarks on today, but I want to highlight 2 issues in particular: perception and national security. Perception matters in geopolitics. The messages we send, internationally or otherwise, are read closely by our allies and by our adversaries, and they carry very real consequences. I need not remind the Minister of the comments made by the President of the United States just last week. Those remarks materially change the context in which this House is considering this deal. Madam Deputy Speaker, the 1966 treaty between the UK and the US agreed to retain sovereignty over the British Indian Ocean Territory. It is clear any attempt to surrender sovereignty violates international law. and I commend my Conservative colleagues in both houses for delaying the bill's passage. But delay is not enough. The surrender bill should be pulled in its entirety. The UK-US relationship is built on trust, particularly in defence and security. When the President states publicly that a deal will damage that relationship and should not proceed, that this deal is an act of great stupidity, the government should listen and act. I'm not suggesting that the United States sees the UK as an unreliable partner. We have stood shoulder to shoulder for decades. But this deal is different. If it proceeds, it will reduce the operability of UK and US forces in the region, diminish our strategic reach and weaken our influence. Responsibility for that lies squarely with this government. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister is in China today. Beijing will also be watching closely. China will welcome any increase in autonomy in the region and with it the opportunity to decimate the marine protected area surrounding the Chagos Islands through its fishing fleet. We know those vessels will not simply be there to fish. They will be there to gather intelligence, to probe our defences and to gain strategic advantage near Diego Garcia. The message this deal sends to our adversaries is clear, that the UK is retreating, diminishing and weakening. That is not the message we should be sending in an increasingly hostile and unpredictable world. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to make one brief point on national security, which I've raised in previous debates and which we've heard from many people this evening. Under the Pelindaba Treaty, neither the UK nor the US will be able to store nuclear weapons on Diego Garcia. We now have confirmation of this from the Deputy Prime Minister of Mauritius. That restriction significantly reduces our capability in a critical region and weakens the security of both ourselves and our allies. Ultimately, Madam Deputy Speaker, this deal is not in the interests of the United Kingdom. It is not in the interests of protecting one of the most important marine environments on the planet. It is not in the interests of the British Chagosians, who have been ignored throughout this process, and it is certainly not in the interests of the British taxpayer. Those on the Labour benches know that another U-turn is looming. This deal is indefensible, and today members have an opportunity to do the right thing, to support this motion and to bring this surrender deal to an end.
Ben Obsujecti.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The UK giving away extremely important land is an act of great stupidity. So wrote the President of the United States only a week ago, and for once, he's not wrong. I've lost track of the number of times I've spoken about the Chagos deal in this House, but each time brings a new stick to beat the government with. It's genuinely difficult to see how the government has got to this point, but its kamikaze negotiating tactics have led it to a point where it can no longer even muster the collective energy of its backbenchers to defend it anymore. The dogged determination of the government to capitulate to a 2019 advisory ruling by the International Court of Justice would be commendable were it not so timid. The UN General Assembly adopted resolutions urging the UK to comply with the ICJ's advisory opinion, but crucially, the US voted in support of the UK, clearly not fearing the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, of which it is not a member. As I'm sure everybody here already knows, the United States support is significant because of the presence of the Naval Support Facility Diego Garcia, a strategically important location that is effectively a persistent aircraft carrier in the Indian Ocean, critical for force projection in the Southern Hemisphere and across Indo-PACOM. On Monday, the Minister for the Overseas Territories was quick to imply that discussions regarding the deal with the United States were an almost daily occurrence. With that in mind, perhaps the Minister, in his summing up, could outline to the House what discussions the government has had with his US counterparts regarding the limitations placed on operations by compliance with the Pelindaba Treaty. Both the UK and Mauritius are satisfied that our existing international obligations are fully compatible with the agreement. That was what a written question said to me when I asked about this question recently. But what precisely does that therefore exclude going forwards? The African Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone Treaty was signed by Mauritius in 1996 and prohibits a myriad of functions relating to nuclear weapons, including possession or control of nuclear weapons. Whilst there are obviously no ICBMs based at Diego Garcia, the US nuclear triad is designed to provide a second strike capability that includes air-launched warheads. Naval Support Facility Diego Garcia is a strategic waypoint for the US Air Force bomber fleet, the B-1, B-2 and B-52 bombers. Following September the 11th, the US used Diego Garcia for operations in Afghanistan and subsequently during the start of the Iraq War. As recently as last May, the US Air Force had B-2 bombers stationed on the island. This is critical because the B-2 Spirit is the delivery method for the Mod 11 B-6112 thermonuclear gravity bomb, the primary weapon for the ground-penetrating mission. So this capability matters. And whilst it will likely never be used, we cannot afford enemies within the region to know that it will never be on the table. We should bear in mind that the Prime Minister is in China this week. Strategic posture across the Pacific, particularly Taiwan and the second island chain, will surely come up in conversation. Ceding the Chagos Islands to a country within China's orbit is yet another strategic misstep in the Prime Minister's inability to deal with China robustly. On the ongoing question of sovereignty, in note number 25 between the Ambassador of the United States of America to the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, written on the 30th of December 1966, point 1 states very clearly, the territory shall remain under United Kingdom sovereignty. This time last year, I asked the government whether the 1966 exchange of notes would require amendment as a result of the change in sovereignty. The 1966 exchange of notes between the UK and US regarding the joint UK-US base on Diego Garcia has been subject to routine amendments and supplementation since signature. Any amendments resulting from the proposed agreement with Mauritius will be factored into this existing process. So could the Minister outline what progress the government has made in that regard? I asked that question on the 5th of February last year, and here we are now, a year later, the treaty on the brink and no update from the government, less for a slightly churlish appearance at the dispatch box in Monday's UQ. The legislation crucially pulled from the other place for that afternoon. Throughout the passage of this bill, the government has deflected, obfuscated, been dragged to the chamber, given us the runaround on detail, gaslit us, and generally tried to force this deal through. The lack of speakers on the government benches is testament to the fact that Labour MPs simply do not want to put their names to this piece of legislation. All it achieves is weakening our military options in the Southern Hemisphere and exempting 80% of Mauritian workers from income tax. Kudos to Mauritian Prime Minister Navin Ramgoolam, clearly a savvier negotiator than our own dear Prime Minister. There is no doubt that China and Russia have noticed this act of total weakness, said President Trump. Perhaps the Prime Minister could ask Xi Jinping about it before he offers him a state visit.
Brings us to the front bench, Shadow Secretary of State, James Cartledge.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I begin by offering the condolences of the opposition to the family of Captain Philip Muldowney of the Royal Artillery, who lost his life tragically training with the British Army this week. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is a pleasure to close today's debate on the Chagos Islands and to hold the government to account for the total meltdown of their attempt to surrender sovereignty of the British Indian Ocean Territory without opposition. Well, today they are getting that opposition, and they're getting it from the Conservatives, because it is us who have exposed the total fallacy of the legal argument used to justify this crazy deal. And let's be clear. It is a truly crazy deal, one of the worst ever proposed to this Parliament. As every single one of my colleagues in their excellent speeches have said, this deal involves our hard-pressed taxpayers, struggling as they are with an ever-growing tax burden since Labour came to power, to hand over another £35 billion to lease back land that we already own freehold. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's our land, over which we have sovereignty, the ultimate guarantor of legal security in a dangerous world. When we need that money for our own armed forces, when the billions given to Mauritius will be used to cut taxes for their people, when Labour know the threats we face are growing and we need Diego Garcia more than ever, when their policy treats the Chagosian people with contempt, the public will scratch their heads and ask a simple question: why are they doing this? Now, to be fair to the Minister who's winding up, last September he tried to spell out the reasons, and I'll quote exactly what he said to justify this crazy deal. He said, and I quote, "Had we not signed that treaty, we could have faced further legal rulings against us within weeks. Further legal rulings might have included arbitrary proceedings against the UK under Annex 7 of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, known as UNCLOS. He went on to say that such a judgment would ultimately threaten operations on the base because it would, and I quote, impact our ability to protect the electromagnetic spectrum from interference." Now, it's bad enough that the government's case rests entirely on rulings that could happen, rulings that might happen.
Worse still, they fail to take into account our clear-cut ability to reject any such hypothetical ruling. So let's consider. We understand the government is afraid of potential legal action by UNCLOS, but Article 298 of UNCLOS states very clearly, when signing, ratifying or acceding to this convention or at any time thereafter, a state may, under 1, declare in writing that it does not accept any one or more of the procedures provided for in Section 2 with respect to one or more of the following categories of disputes, including, as item B, disputes concerning military activities. In terms of operational threats to the base, the government's argument is that hypothetical action by UNCLOS might lead to further hypothetical action by the International Telecommunications Union, thus hypothetically threatening the electromagnetic spectrum on the base at Diego Garcia. Well, Article 48 of the Constitution of the International Telecommunications Union, which is entitled Installations for National Defence Services, states, and I quote under 1, Member States retain their entire freedom with regard to military radio installations. To clarify further, the Telecoms Minister, the Honourable Gentleman for Rhondda and Ogmore, who is always a helpful soul, confirmed in written answer last February to my Right Honourable friend for Rayleigh and Wickford, and I quote, individual countries have the sovereign right to manage and use the radio spectrum within their border the way they wish, subject to not causing interference with other countries. And he goes on to say, the ITU cannot challenge the UK's use of civilian or military spectrum. Slam dunk. Now we have it. We can challenge it UNCLOS where military bases are concerned, and the ITU cannot challenge our use of electromagnetic spectrum. So isn't this the truth? There is no threat to this country if we maintain our sovereignty over Diego Garcia. But there is a massive threat if we surrender it. Clear and unambiguous threats to the most sensitive and critical of all our military operational considerations for ourselves and the United States, those that relate to our ability to use nuclear weapons and deter the most serious threats to our nation. Yesterday, it was confirmed that the Deputy Prime Minister of Mauritius, Paul Berenguer, has stated that nuclear weapons, and I quote, could not be stored on Diego Garcia if Labour's deal goes through. Crystal clear. This is because Mauritius is a signatory to the Pelindaba Treaty, prohibiting the stationing of nuclear weapons across Africa and thereby including all territory of Mauritius. We repeatedly warned ministers of the threat arising from the Pelindaba Treaty, but they dismissed our concerns and today couldn't answer the questions at all. So can the minister tell us if anyone in government has discussed the storage of nuclear weapons on Diego Garcia with the US administration? And in particular, has the Prime Minister at any point discussed this matter with President Trump? Is it not another example of the total madness of Labour's crazy Chagos deal that we, who rely on a naval nuclear deterrent to keep us safe in a dangerous world, are surrendering sovereignty of one of the most vital naval bases in the world to a nation signed up to a treaty outlawing the stationing of nuclear weapons on that territory?
Exactly.
Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have had some absolutely fantastic speeches today, and I have to pay tribute, I must say, to the Honourable Gentleman for Macclesfield and Rugby in answering the distress flare from the Whip's office, because they had two more contributions than in the UQ the other day, when not a single Labour MP stood up in support of the government. But on this side, we had real passion, because none of us support this deal. We've consistently opposed it. As my honourable friend for Bexhill and Battle said, what does this say about our strategic priorities? As the honourable gentleman for Wetherby and Easingwold said, this is a government without a strategic policy on China. What message does it send to them, especially when we've agreed the super embassy? But I have to say a specific and very special mention to my honourable friend for Hinckley and Bosworth for an absolutely brilliant speech that totally demolished the government's case around the financial position, not a flesh wound in sight after that. And in fact, if you bear with, my honourable friend I think referred to the sketch with the Black Knight. But increasingly today we think of another Monty Python sketch, Madam Deputy Speaker, because they think that this treaty has been paused, that it is merely resting. But we suspect that this treaty is increasingly pushing up the daisies. And I can assure you, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will campaign with every bit of fight we've got to ensure that this is an ex-treaty. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, to conclude, I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman and then I'll wrap up.
Giving way. On that question of cost, could he tell the House how much the Conservative government were offering for such a deal? Is it higher or lower than Labour's offer? And if he doesn't know, will he put down a written parliamentary question or submit a Freedom of Information request to the Foreign Office to find out?
I don't think the Honourable Gentleman quite understands. We didn't sign a deal, we wouldn't sign a deal, because the terms were totally unacceptable. And they've gotten an awful lot worse since then. 35 billion times worse since then. That's the cost, £35 billion from freedom of information from the government themselves. It's an absolute disgrace and why we will be voting against it. So to conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, I asked why the government were doing this. Surrendering, I give way to my honourable friend.
Honourable friend for giving way. I have one simple final question to ask him. Will he please tell the House, is it now Conservative Party policy to give self-determination and the right of resettlement to the Chagosian people?
He knows that we've opposed this, but on self-determination, I would like him to ask his leader if he believes in the self-determination of the people of Ukraine, invaded by Russia, brutally bombed by Russia, a leader who still says that that was provoked by NATO. He should be ashamed of that if he believes in self-determination, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, to conclude, and I am going to conclude, I asked why the government were doing this, surrendering our land that we own freehold, only to lease it back for £35 billion. Isn't the reason the same one as why they are surrendering our brave veterans to a new era of lawfare? Isn't it the same reason Labour gave up our fishing grounds, the most critical possession of an island nation, to access an EU defence fund from which they have not had a penny? The answer: this is a weak Prime Minister who always fails to put Britain's national interest first. If Labour were strong enough to put our national interest first, surely they would stand up to Mauritius and reject this deal. After all, if they did that, they could spend the money saved on our armed forces at a time when rearmament at home is on hold, precisely because Labour have failed to properly fund defence. But I finish with this, Madam Deputy Speaker. If there is one silver lining to having such a weak Prime Minister, it is his habit of constant U-turns. We've had 13 U-turns to date from this government, Madam Deputy Speaker. Wouldn't the best thing be for our national security for Labour to recognise that the game is up, to turn their pause on the Chagos bill into a permanent full stop and scrap this terrible deal?
So, Luke Pollard.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. What a terrible example of collective amnesia. For the entire debate, not a single one of the Tory MPs in their remarks could say why they started the negotiations. And for the sake of ease, I'm happy taking interventions if the Conservative MP can start their intervention with the reason their government started the negotiations. Because if it is true, I'll give him a second, if it is true, as the Shadow Defence Secretary says, that it is a crazy deal, why did they start it? If it is true that it damaged our national security, why did they start it? Not an answer from any single one of them, but let's see if he can give it a go.
I am surprised that a party that represents trade unionists doesn't understand that when there's a dispute between one party and another, it's a good thing to try and talk about it. There is a very big difference. Why do we start it? Because there's a dispute. You need to talk to other people to understand what's going on. That's exactly what any responsible country should do. There's a far difference between signing off a treaty and entering into talks with someone. Trade unionists should know that.
Well, it's a curious position that the previous Conservative government started negotiations because they wanted to act like a trade union. I think that is a poor example. But look, I was asked a number of important questions throughout this debate, and I'm happy replying to some of those. But let me just start with some context of this one. It is staggering that the party opposite, when in government, the Conservatives, held 11 rounds of negotiation. 85% of the negotiations conducted with them, and seem to have this collective amnesia that think they stopped the deal, when on the 29th of April, on gov.uk, The statement between the then Prime Minister and the Mauritian Prime Minister said, during the phone call, they discussed the progress of negotiations between the UK and Mauritius on the exercise of sovereignty over Biot, and both leaders instructed their teams to continue to work at pace. A general election was called less than a month later on this one here. It is staggering to do this. And so let me be absolutely clear. When we came to office, we inherited a set of negotiations. We inherited a set of negotiations that had 11 rounds on this one here, and we reinforced it. We added a 24-mile nautical buffer zone, so no activity can take place in there without our say-so, and an effective veto on all development in the Chagos archipelago. Happy giving way.
I'm grateful to him. I completely and utterly opposed my government when they even started this, categorically. Oh, I did. I've been in opposition no matter who's in government. Now, the key point here is I have to say to him, though, it's not what you start, it's what you finish. And even though I was opposed to them, when I spoke to Lord Cameron and I said he's got to stop it, he took the decision to stop it and finish it. Why will this government not see the evidence and stop it now?
Well, he nearly got to why they started the negotiations. It wasn't quite here in my bar of intervention, but I appreciate him giving it a good go. But let me see if he can do better.
Could the Minister explain why the previous Labour government entered negotiations in 2009 when the first talks took place with the Mauritian government, which they ultimately ruled out as being criticised for being a unilateral decision around the marine protected area?
Again, he didn't quite hit my bar, but I'm sure I'll get a PQ from him about it shortly. I'm afraid they started the negotiations and they want everyone to forget it. They want the public to forget it. They want their own MPs to forget that they started the negotiations. Look, if they can't do deals, they're in the wrong place. But look, there were some very interesting questions asked, and I want to try and deal with some of them. Madam Deputy Speaker, I've been asked to finish early so the shadow cabinet can sit. And so I do want to make sure that I can get through as many of these as I can before the front bench need to go busy themselves in a meeting. But let me try and answer a few of the questions. The Liberal Democrat spokesperson asked a very sensible question about the amendment that his party placed in the other place. He will appreciate it is a wrecking amendment, so it's one that we could not support. But he will also be clear that we take the issues behind it very seriously. And I'm glad that he continues to raise the issues of Chagossians. It's an important one. The gentleman that now sits on the other side of the House over here raised the issue around resettlement on the outer islands. He made the case that that's something he really wants to see. He wants to see resettlement on the outer islands that helps restore some of the dignity to the Chagossians who had been treated appallingly many decades previously and since. He will know that the deal that we have signed with Mauritius includes the right to resettle on the outer islands and for visits to take place to Diego Garcia. It might not satisfy all his concerns around it, but I hope he can understand that that is a step forward in relation to what has been said. And I'm grateful for the member for Macclesfield for his speech and talked about the uncertainty. It is the uncertainty on the operation of the base that concerns me most about this, about the continuation disruption as a defence minister, and that is what this deal seeks to close off, and he was right to do so. The honourable gentleman that was a defence minister describes it as he learns something new every day. Every day can indeed be a school day, and what I've learnt is that when he swapped from one side of the House to the other, miraculously his opinion on this deal changed as well, because he backed it when he was a minister and now he opposes it when he is on the backbenches opposite. That does say something about it. My honourable friend for Rugby asked the very same questions I started with. Why did the Conservatives start this negotiation? A question they still can't answer. Still can't answer. And I noticed the member for Bexhill and Battle has found his voice only when he's completed his chicken run from the seat he thought he was going to lose to the new one here. I have to say, but let me be absolutely clear on this point. Let me be absolutely clear on this point. It is shameful that the Conservatives are trying to drag other overseas territories into the mess that they're arguing for here. Shameful. Let's be absolutely clear. The Falkland Islands government, the Falklands, that they want to try and create an impression that their sovereignty is not secure by their speeches today. The Falkland Islands have noted that the agreement has no impact on the self-determination of the Falkland Islands people and the existing and future relationship between the Falkland Islands and the United Kingdom. So let's not hear any more Conservative MPs raising questions about the future of the Falkland Islands. No, I will not. He's got a meeting to get to. I'm trying to help him get there. Let's give it a go. I think he should sit down and prepare for his next meeting. Now, the gentleman at the back, the gentleman for Wetherby, I have to say, was a good voice in this debate. I have to say he made a very sound case about the geostrategic picture changing in the world, a really important contribution, and his work on the NATO Parliamentary Assembly is one that gives him added insight, not only into the importance of the base, the importance of the UK-US relationship, but also the importance of making sure that we have a strong defence. And I have to say, we will continue to invest in our national security. I'm very proud of my country. I'm very proud of our armed forces. I'm proud that we are increasing defence spending under this government to the highest level that hasn't been seen since the end of the Cold War. So there's more that needs to be done there. The gentleman for Hinckley and Bosworth, who spoke for a good 20 minutes in his speech, spoke very sadly, but I'm afraid he seemed to have read everything but the treaty himself, because he was asking questions around what can be stored on the base. Now, if he looks at the treaty in Annex 1, 1A of the treaty describes it that there will be unrestricted access, basing and overflights for the United Kingdom and the United States of America aircraft and vessels to enter into the sea and airspace of Diego Garcia. 1B says unrestricted ability means 1, to control and conduct to control the conduct and deployment of our armed operations and lethal capabilities, and 2, control the storage of all goods, including but not limited to fuels, weapons, and hazardous materials. Unfortunately, the Shadow Defence Secretary forgets his time as Defence Minister. We do not talk about the location of nuclear weapons. But the protections were designed and tested at the highest level of the US security establishment, who supported the UK proceeding with the deal. We continue to work closely with the US to ensure that the necessary arrangements are put in place.
Point of order, Dr. Luke Evans.
I wonder if you could help me, Chair. The Minister specifically made comments directed at me about questions, opening an opportunity for how do I get a recourse to respond to those questions that were posed to me as a member.
Honourable member will know it is entirely at the Minister's discretion, as it would be with any other speaker if he chooses to give way or not. It's not a matter for the Chair. I'm sure the Minister's heard. Luke Pollard.
I appreciate the honourable gentleman. I'm very pro-Luke's, generally speaking, but he has had 20 minutes to do that, and a few more interventions won't correct the quality of his speech, I'm afraid. But happy giving way to the gentleman opposite, next to him.
Okay. Very specifically, he's read out something about what can be stored on the island. Can that include, and does it include, nuclear weapons? And regarding the earlier point about a deal, may I remind him of a saying from an earlier context, a different context: no deal is better than a bad deal.
Well, to help his front bench get to their shadow cabinet meeting, I won't read out the same points again. However, he invites me to, so I will. Control the storage of all goods, including but not limited to fuels, weapons, and hazardous materials. I'm going very clear on this, but there's a few other questions that I want to get to that have been asked in this debate that I think it's important to get there. The member for Spelthorne, in his contributions, spoke about value. I like the way he approached that thing. It's a good characteristic style that he has, and I enjoyed that. When he spoke about comparison of value, I think it is always worth noting that roughly-ish, it's about £100 million a year that we would be securing the continued operation for the base for. That compares favourably to the French base that the French rent in Djibouti, which is next to a Chinese naval base. Our base secures a 24-hour nautical exclusion zone around it, full control of the electromagnetic spectrum, something the Shadow Defence Secretary doesn't seem to understand, but is actually quite important. And also... Oh, go on. He could be late for his meeting.
It's very kind. Very specific question. That annex does not mention nuclear weapons. We've asked this repeatedly throughout the debate today. It is a matter of critical national security concern. The Deputy Prime Minister of Mauritius has clearly stated nuclear weapons cannot be stored on the base. Is that correct? Yes or no?
I feel like I have to read out the point for a third time. I mean, no wonder they couldn't conclude the deal at this rate. Look at this. It says in Annex 1, control of the storage of all goods, including but not limited to fuels, weapons and hazardous materials. We do not comment on the location of nuclear weapons. He might remember that when he was a Defence Minister. But look, Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope that in this debate and in the boisterous amnesia that we've heard on the party opposite here, that the voices of the Chagosians can truly be heard, because there were some very good remarks about the Chagosians from our Lib Dem colleague there and from the recently reformed colleague at the back there. It is important that the Chagosians have their greater involvement. That is why we've set up a Chagosian Trust Fund. And there was a question around would the Chagosians have a say in the Trust Fund, and we can confirm that from the 12th of December, Mauritius have confirmed that they're put in place the legislation to enact the Chagosian Trust Fund. It will be run by Chagosians for Chagosians, and it will include UK-based Chagosians as well. And I hope that goes, again, some way, providing the clarity that the member was seeking for when it came to that particular question. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I said that I would finish at 5:02 so the front bench can get to their shadow cabinet meeting. I will finish at 5:02 because I'm a man of my word in that respect. Thank you.
The question is as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye! Of the contrary, no. No! Division. Clear the lobby. The question is as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. The tellers for the ayes are Paul Holmes and David Simmons. The tellers for the noes, Deirdre Costigan and Mark Ferguson.
to the right, 103. The noes to the left, 284.
Oh, really? Oh.
The ayes to the right were 103, the noes to the left 284. So the noes have it, the noes have it. Unlock.
Point of order.
Point of order, Sir Roger Gale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's clearly an embarrassment for the fact that a Foreign Office Minister was unable to vote during this crucial debate on the Chagos Islands. I wonder if you could have a word with the Speaker and see if it would be possible to extend the time limit to allow people to get to the chamber.
Can I thank the Right Honourable Member for that point of order, which he will know full well is not a point of order. Point of order, Calum Miller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On a point of order, I do seek your guidance. We spent the last 3.5 hours debating the UK-US base on Diego Garcia. Just before we began that debate, President Trump announced on social media that a US armada is positioned to attack Iran. Can I seek your advice, Madam Deputy Speaker, on whether it would be appropriate for a Minister to come urgently to the Chamber to update the House and to clarify the Government's position on the use of UK assets and personnel in any such attack?
What does the Foreign Office do about it?
Can I thank the Honourable Member for his point of order and for having given notice of it? Mr Speaker has received no notice from ministers that they intend to make a statement on this matter. Ministers on the front bench will, however, have heard the Honourable Member's point of order. I will allow a few moments for the front benches to swap over.